The thermometer outside Jack Thornton's fire lookout tower hadn't climbed above freezing in over 2 weeks. The winter of 2023 had brought unprecedented weather patterns to North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains, transforming the usually mild southern highlands into a treacherous landscape of ice and snow. The pristine wilderness that normally welcomed hikers and nature enthusiasts now stood as a frozen fortress, challenging the survival instincts of every creature that called these mountains home. From his perch among the swaying pines, Jack watched as sheets of ice encased branches and boulders, creating a crystalline world that sparkled dangerously in the pale winter sun. Even the most adaptable wildlife struggled to navigate the treacherous terrain, as cycles of thawing and flash freezing created deadly conditions throughout the forest. This was nature at its most beautiful and most brutal, a reality Jack had come to respect deeply during his years in Pinewood Valley. At 38, Jack Thornton had chosen this solitary existence after leaving behind a successful but ultimately unfulfilling career as a wildlife photographer for glossy nature magazines. 5 years ago, he'd traded his Manhattan apartment for this renovated fire lookout tower, purchasing the decommissioned Forestry Service structure and transforming it into both home and personal wildlife observation post. Situated 12 miles from the small town of Riverdale, the tower offered him the solitude he craved after years of chasing deadlines and commercial shots that increasingly felt staged and artificial. His transition to part-time park ranger had come naturally, his extensive knowledge of wildlife behavior and photography skills proving valuable to local conservation efforts. The position allowed him enough income to maintain his modest lifestyle, while spending most of his time documenting the undisturbed behaviors of animals in their natural habitat, the kind of authentic images he'd always wanted to capture. His photographs now served science rather than sales, tracking migration patterns, population changes, and the impacts of climate shifts on the mountain ecosystem. Jack had always been more comfortable with animals than people. Where human relationships seemed complicated and draining, his connections with the wildlife around his tower felt direct and honest. He respected their space, and in return, they accepted his presence as part of the landscape. This mutual coexistence was all the companionship he needed. This morning, like every other during the harsh winter, Jack wrapped himself in his weathered park service jacket and began his daily rituals. The wood stove crackled with fresh logs, while his coffee brewed slowly on the small propane stove. Through the tower's panoramic windows, Jack conducted his morning wildlife count, noting the movements of the white-tailed deer that picked their way carefully across the icy forest floor, and the family of raccoons that had taken shelter under the equipment shed nearby. After logging his observations, Jack turned his attention to the solar power system, clearing accumulated ice from the panels to ensure he maintained enough charge for his radio equipment, his lifeline to the outside world during these isolated winter months. The routine was simple but purposeful, rooted in both necessity and his genuine interest in the rhythms of the wilderness around him. From his elevated vantage point, Jack kept meticulous records of the forest's inhabitants, noting how they adapted to the increasingly erratic weather patterns. His journals contained detailed sketches and notes tracking behavior changes across seasons and years, forming an invaluable record of climate impact on native species. This wasn't just work, it was his way of honoring the natural world that had given him sanctuary from the artificial demands of his former life. As afternoon approached, Jack prepared for his daily patrol, lacing up his insulated boots and strapping ice cleats to their soles. These short excursions allowed him to check wildlife feeding stations, clear fallen branches from hiking trails, and photograph any unusual activity. Today, however, the sky threatened another ice storm, and he debated whether to postpone his rounds until the weather cleared. The decision was made for him when Jack noticed something unusual through his binoculars. The deer that normally grazed calmly at the forest edge were startled, their white tails raised in alarm as they bounded into the denser woods. Simultaneously, the birds fell silent. Their morning chatter abruptly ceased, creating an unnatural stillness that immediately raised Jack's instincts. In his years of wildlife observation, Jack had learned to read these subtle cues. When the forest suddenly went quiet, it usually signaled the presence of a predator. But something felt different about this silence, more complete, more tense than the usual momentary pause when a coyote or bobcat passed through. The sky darkened prematurely as the promised storm clouds gathered, casting the forest in an eerie twilight despite the early afternoon hour. Jack scanned the tree line methodically, searching for whatever had disturbed the natural order. Through his powerful telephoto lens, he swept across the landscape until a movement caught his eye, something large moving with difficulty through the ice-laden underbrush. His pulse quickened as the shape became clearer, the distinctive profile of an American black bear, visible despite the gathering gloom. Jack lowered his camera in confusion. Black bears should be deep in hibernation during January, their metabolism slowed to survive the winter months without food. Yet here was one moving deliberately through the frozen landscape, each labored step betraying obvious distress. As the storm's first ice pellets began to strike the tower windows, Jack tracked the bear's progress with mounting concern. The animal moved with unnatural stiffness, its gait awkward and pained. Through his zoom lens, Jack could see that parts of its fur were matted and frozen, ice crystals forming around its muzzle with each labored breath. But what truly alarmed him was the bear's behavior. Instead of following natural cover, it moved in a direct line across exposed terrain, heading toward the abandoned ranger cabin that sat a quarter-mile from Jack's tower. The old cabin had been vacant for years, deemed structurally unsound after severe flood damage and replaced by modern facilities elsewhere in the park. Jack had documented its slow reclamation by nature, vines climbing its walls, small creatures nesting in its eaves, but had never seen larger wildlife show interest in the deteriorating structure. As darkness fell prematurely under the storm clouds, Jack watched in astonishment as the bear reached the cabin and, with seemingly deliberate movements, pushed against the weather-worn door. The rotting wood gave way with surprising ease, and the bear disappeared inside the abandoned structure. The behavior was so unprecedented, so contrary to everything Jack knew about black bears, that he found himself questioning what he'd just witnessed. The radio crackled with static as the storm intensified, the emergency broadcast warning of severe conditions and advising all park personnel to remain in secure locations. Outside, the freezing rain transformed into driving sleet that coated every surface with a dangerous glaze. Jack knew that attempting to investigate the cabin now would be foolhardy at best, potentially fatal at worst. Yet something about the bear's deliberate movements, its obvious distress, and the unnatural seeking of human shelter nagged at his mind. Little did Jack know that this moment would mark the beginning of an extraordinary encounter that would challenge everything he thought he understood about wildlife behavior and test the limits of his own compassion in ways he never imagined possible. Through the long night, Jack found sleep impossible. The storm raged with unexpected fury, rattling the tower's windows and encasing its metal supports in inches of ice. His thoughts continually returned to the bear, whose unnatural behavior suggested either severe injury or desperate hunger, both potentially dangerous situations for man and beast alike. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape glittering dangerously in the morning light. Every surface was encased in ice, tree branches hanging precariously low under the weight. Using his spotting scope, Jack could see the cabin in the distance, its roof now partially collapsed under the ice's weight. There was no sign of movement, no indication whether the bear remained inside or had moved on during the night. Jack weighed his options carefully. Protocol dictated reporting unusual wildlife behavior to the ranger station, but with power lines down throughout the region, his radio picked up nothing but static. The nearest functioning station would be in Riverdale, unreachable until the roads cleared. If he waited for official assistance, it might be days before help arrived, and if the bear was injured, each passing hour decreased its chances of survival. Yet approaching an injured bear, especially one seeking shelter in a confined space, contradicted every safety guideline Jack had ever taught to park visitors. Bears in distress were unpredictable, potentially aggressive, and capable of inflicting serious injury even when weakened. The collapsed roof added another layer of danger, as the structure itself might be on the verge of complete failure. As the morning progressed, Jack continued his surveillance, looking for any sign of the bear emerging from the cabin. By midday, when no movement had been observed, a growing certainty settled in his mind. Something was very wrong. The bear's unusual behavior. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Combined with its continued presence in the cabin, despite the passing storm, suggested it might be too injured or weak to leave. With each passing hour, Jack felt the weight of responsibility growing. He had spent years observing wildlife without interference, documenting rather than engaging, maintaining the respectful distance that separated humans from the wild creatures they shared the mountain with. Intervention went against his professional training and personal philosophy. Nature had its own way of handling injuries and illness, not always kind, but part of the greater balance he had dedicated his life to understanding. Yet, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ice-covered ground, Jack found himself preparing his emergency pack. He included a tranquilizer gun from his ranger equipment, medical supplies, heavy gloves, and his camera, the latter more from habit than any thought of documentation. Each item placed in the pack represented a step away from observation and toward intervention, a crossing of the invisible boundary he had always maintained. "This goes against everything in the handbook," he muttered to himself as he laced his boots. But something about this situation felt different. The bear had sought out human structure, had shown extraordinary behavior that seemed almost like a deliberate request for help. To ignore that felt like a greater violation of his connection to this mountain and its inhabitants than intervention did. As Jack secured his ice cleats and adjusted his pack, he knew he was making a choice that could cost him his job, his safety, or both. The risk assessment part of his brain listed all the reasons this was foolhardy: approaching an injured predator, entering an unstable structure, acting without backup or authorization. Yet something deeper than professional training was driving him now, a sense of responsibility toward a creature that had, against all natural instinct, sought proximity to human shelter in its moment of need. With a deep breath, Jack descended the tower stairs and stepped onto the treacherous ice-covered ground, his cleats biting into the slick surface. The decision was made. Whatever awaited him at the cabin, he would no longer be merely an observer. The journey to the cabin, normally a 15-minute walk, took Jack nearly an hour as he navigated the ice-transformed landscape. Tree branches hung dangerously low, occasionally cracking and falling as their frozen weight became too much to bear. The forest was unnaturally silent, most wildlife still sheltering after the severe storm. As he approached the cabin, Jack slowed his pace, alert for any signs of the bear. The structure looked even worse up close. The roof partially caved in on one side, windows long since broken, the wooden walls weathered and rotting. That any animal would choose this as shelter over natural options seemed increasingly bizarre. Jack circled the building at a safe distance, studying it from all angles before approaching further. There were no sounds from within, no movement visible through the broken windows. The only indication of the bear's presence was a set of tracks, now partially filled with ice, leading to the sagging door that stood partially ajar. Moving as quietly as the crunching ice would allow, Jack approached the cabin's entrance. He readied his tranquilizer gun, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. If the bear was severely injured or aggressive, sedation might be necessary before he could assess its condition properly. "Hello in there," he called softly, wanting to announce his presence rather than startle the animal. There was no response, no sound of movement from within the darkened interior. With growing concern, Jack pushed the door wider with his boot, wincing at the creak of rusted hinges. The cabin's interior was dim, illuminated only by the grey light filtering through broken windows and the partially collapsed roof. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, Jack saw that the single room was largely empty, save for the remnants of old furniture. A broken table, a rusted wood stove, shelves sagging from the walls. And there, in the far corner beneath the most intact portion of the roof, lay the bear. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The bear was completely still, curled in what appeared to be a defensive posture, its normally glossy black fur matted with ice and debris. For a terrible moment, he thought he had arrived too late. Then he saw the slight rise and fall of its ribcage, shallow but present. With extreme caution, Jack moved closer, speaking in low, gentle tones to alert the bear to his presence. "Easy. There, big guy. I just want to see if you're okay." The bear's eyes opened, dull with pain but alert enough to track Jack's movement. Yet instead of the defensive response Jack expected, the bear merely watched him, making no attempt to rise or show aggression. This unnatural passivity confirmed Jack's fears. The animal was in serious distress. As Jack edged closer, the bear made a soft grunting sound and shifted slightly, revealing what it had been curled around. Jack's flashlight beam illuminated something that made him forget all concerns for his own safety. Nestled against the bear's body were two tiny cubs, their eyes still closed, no more than a few days old. "Oh my God," Jack whispered, understanding dawning with stunning clarity. This wasn't just any bear. This was a mother who had given birth prematurely during hibernation, likely disturbed by the unusual weather patterns. And she had done the unthinkable, sought out human structure as shelter for her vulnerable newborns when her natural den had become compromised. The implications were staggering. Black bears typically gave birth during deep hibernation in January or February, with cubs remaining in the den until spring. For this mother to be moving her newborns in January through ice and freezing temperatures, something catastrophic must have happened to her original den. And in her desperate maternal instinct, she had chosen this abandoned human structure as her best option for their survival. The mother bear's eyes remained fixed on Jack, carrying neither aggression nor fear, but something he could only interpret as exhaustion and resignation. It was a gaze that transcended species, the universal look of a mother who had done everything possible to protect her young and now had nothing left to give. In that moment, Jack knew this was no longer about a single injured bear. It was about 3 lives hanging in the balance, dependent on the decisions he would make in the coming hours. The next 72 hours tested every skill Jack had acquired in his years as a photographer, ranger, and solitary mountain dweller. With the mother bear too weak to move and the newborn cubs completely dependent on her, any thought of relocating them was impossible. Instead, Jack transformed the failing cabin into a makeshift maternity den, working carefully under the watchful eyes of the exhausted mother. His first priority was stabilizing the structure. Using fallen branches and materials from his tower, Jack reinforced the compromised roof and secured the walls against further collapse. He created a windbreak around the bear's corner, using tarps and branches to trap precious heat while still allowing for ventilation. The mother bear's condition was precarious. Dehydrated and malnourished from the premature interruption of her hibernation, she needed nutrition and warmth to produce milk for her cubs. Jack melted snow over portable heat packs, mixing in the honey and protein supplements he kept for emergency rations. Approaching the bear with this offering required a level of trust that defied all wildlife management protocols. Yet the mother accepted the nourishment with surprising docility, her instinctive caution overridden by maternal need. Each visit to the cabin required navigating the treacherous landscape between tower and makeshift den, carrying supplies, fresh bedding materials, and the specialized milk replacer Jack had requested via his emergency radio when communications briefly returned. The few hours of tenuous connection also allowed him to consult with Dr. Elena Foster, the regional wildlife veterinarian, though her advice came with stern warnings about the dangers of his unorthodox intervention. "This goes against every protocol. We have, Jack," her voice had crackled through the static. "Black bear mothers are among the most protective animals in North America. The fact that she's tolerating your presence suggests she's in worse condition than you realize." Yet as days passed, Jack witnessed something remarkable. The mother bear's strength gradually returned, her eyes regaining alertness, even as she remained protectively curled around her cubs. More extraordinary was her growing acceptance of Jack's presence, watching him with what he could only describe as guarded cooperation as he changed the bedding materials and left fresh water and food within her reach. "I've never seen anything like it," Jack reported during his next radio contact with Dr. Foster. "It's almost as if she understands I'm trying to help. She's still wild, still cautious, but there's a level of tolerance that defies explanation." "Bears are more intelligent than we give them credit for," Dr. Foster admitted reluctantly. "There have been isolated reports of injured bears seeking human assistance, but a mother with newborns allowing human proximity, that's unprecedented. Document everything, Jack. This could be extraordinarily valuable for our understanding of bear cognition." And document he did. Between his care visits, Jack photographed the family from a respectful distance, capturing the mother's gentle cleaning of her cubs, their first awkward attempts to crawl, the protective way she positioned herself between them and the cabin door whenever she sensed potential threats. The cubs grew stronger daily, their tiny bodies plumping as their mother's milk production stabilized with improved nutrition. Jack named them quietly in his notes. Scout, the more adventurous male who seemed determined to explore beyond the nest of branches and tarps, and Nova, the smaller female who remained closer to her mother's warmth. For the mother, Jack chose the name Ranger, partly for the irony of a wild bear taking shelter in a ranger cabin, but mostly for the watchful, protective presence she maintained over her growing family. The name felt fitting for an animal whose extraordinary instincts had led her to break every rule of natural behavior to ensure her cubs' survival. As the weeks passed and winter maintained its grip on the mountains, Jack's solitary routine transformed entirely around the needs of the bear family. The boundaries between observer and participant, between wildlife management and active care, blurred and shifted as he found himself increasingly invested in their survival. By early March, the changes in both Jack and the bear family were profound. Ranger had regained much of her strength, moving more comfortably around the reinforced cabin that Jack had gradually transformed into a suitable temporary den. The cubs, now with eyes open and growing more active daily, had become the center of an unexpected family unit that defied natural boundaries. Jack found himself changed in equally significant ways. The man who had sought solitude and non-interference now planned his days around care visits, his tower walls covered with photographs documenting the cub's development. More surprisingly, he had begun speaking aloud during his visits, narrating his actions to Ranger in a calm, steady voice that seemed to reassure her. "Just changing the water, Ranger. Nothing to worry about," he would say as he moved around the cabin, maintaining eye contact with the watchful mother. "The cubs are looking stronger every day. You're doing an amazing job." He couldn't explain, even to himself, why he felt compelled to speak to her as though she understood. Yet her responses, the relaxing of her posture when he spoke, the way she would watch him with what appeared to be recognition, made the one-sided conversations feel strangely natural. Dr. Foster, who had finally managed to visit the site during a brief weather improvement, had been astonished by what she observed. "This level of tolerance from a mother with cubs," she'd whispered as they watched Ranger allow Jack to replace bedding materials just feet from where the cubs played. "It challenges everything we thought we knew about bear behavior." "She made the first choice," Jack had responded simply. "Coming to a human structure instead of finding natural shelter, I'm just honoring the trust that decision implied." As spring slowly approached, Jack faced a growing dilemma. The cabin, while functional as an emergency shelter, was not suitable for a growing bear family. Soon, Ranger would need to return to the forest with her cubs, teaching them to forage and develop the skills they would need for independent survival. Yet the unusually long winter meant natural food sources remained scarce, creating a dangerous transition period. Jack consulted with Dr. Foster and the Forestry Service, developing a gradual reintroduction plan that would ease the family's transition back to fully wild existence. Together, they identified a suitable area at the forest edge within sight of Jack's tower, close enough to supplement with food if necessary during the early weeks, yet far enough from human trails to allow for natural behavior development. The day Jack removed the reinforcements from the cabin door, creating a permanent opening for Ranger to come and go freely, marked a turning point in their unusual relationship. He stepped back, camera ready but heart conflicted, as he waited to see what choice she would make. Ranger approached the opening cautiously, her cubs tumbling behind her with their newfound mobility. She paused at the threshold, her dark eyes finding Jack where he stood at a respectful distance. For a long moment, bear and man regarded each other, wild animal and human connected by weeks of unexpected cooperation. Then, with deliberate movements, Ranger stepped into the sunlight, her cubs following close behind. She didn't flee into the forest as Jack had half expected. Instead, she settled in a patch of sunlight just outside the cabin, watching as her cubs explored the immediate surroundings under her attentive gaze. It was neither a complete departure nor a continuation of dependence, but rather, Jack realized, with a sense of wonder, a new phase in their extraordinary journey together. As April brought the first true signs of spring to the Blue Ridge Mountains, the transition of Ranger and her cubs back to fully wild existence progressed with remarkable smoothness. The family established a pattern of spending days exploring increasingly wider territories around the cabin while returning to the familiar shelter at night. Jack maintained his observation from a growing distance, gradually reducing supplemental feeding as natural food sources became more available. He documented Ranger, teaching her cubs to turn over logs for insects, to identify edible spring plants, to climb trees for safety, all the essential skills young bears needed to master. The Forestry Service, initially skeptical of Jack's unorthodox intervention, now recognized the unprecedented research opportunity his documentation provided. With Dr. Foster's endorsement, his actions were retroactively approved, and a small team of wildlife researchers began making periodic visits to observe the family from the concealment of Jack's tower. "What you've captured here," Dr. Foster told him as they reviewed his photographs, "could revolutionize our understanding of bear cognition and adaptability." The level of trust Ranger developed, her willingness to accept human proximity during her most vulnerable period, it suggests capabilities for discernment and relationship that go far beyond our current models of wild animal behavior. By mid-April, Ranger began spending entire days away from the cabin with her growing cubs, returning less frequently as they established a more natural routine. Jack knew the full separation was coming, a necessary step for the cubs' proper development as wild bears. Yet he found himself watching for them each evening, camera ready, but also feeling a personal investment that went beyond scientific documentation. The day they didn't return at all brought a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction at the successful rehabilitation, scientific pride in the documentation he'd gathered, but also an unexpected sense of loss. The cabin, now permanently altered by their presence, stood empty but somehow changed. No longer an abandoned structure, but a site of extraordinary connection. Jack returned to his tower that night, believing the most remarkable chapter of his wildlife career had come to its natural conclusion. The story of the bear who sought human shelter and the man who had helped her family survive would become research papers, educational materials, perhaps even a book. But the direct connection, he assumed, had reached its necessary end. He was wrong. A week later, as Jack conducted routine maintenance on his weather equipment, movement at the forest edge caught his attention. There, standing in a shaft of morning sunlight, was Ranger, her cubs gamboling around her legs with growing confidence. She was watching the tower directly, her posture relaxed but purposeful. Jack raised his binoculars, heart racing with unexpected joy at seeing the family thriving. As he observed them, Ranger did something that stopped his breath entirely. She moved deliberately toward a fallen log, supervised her cubs as they practiced climbing over it, then looked directly toward the tower again. After a moment, she guided the cubs toward a berry thicket just emerging with spring growth, demonstrating how to test the stems with gentle teeth. Again, she looked toward Jack's position. "She's showing me," he whispered in disbelief. "She's showing me that they're learning." For nearly an hour, Ranger moved through a series of natural behaviors with her cubs, each time pausing to direct her gaze toward the tower where she knew Jack watched. It wasn't the random movement of a wild animal unaware of observation. It was a deliberate demonstration, a communication across species boundaries that defied conventional understanding. When Dr. Foster arrived the following day, skeptical of Jack's excited radio description, she witnessed the same behavior. "This is beyond extraordinary," she admitted, as they watched Ranger guide her cubs through what almost resembled a showcasing of their developing skills. "She's not just tolerating human presence, she's actively acknowledging your role in their survival. I've never seen anything like it in 30 years of wildlife veterinary work." The pattern continued throughout spring and into early summer. Ranger and her cubs would appear every few days at the forest edge, within sight of the tower, sometimes approaching the cabin briefly before returning to the woods. Each visit seemed timed to display new developments, the cubs improving climbing skills, their growing independence, their increasingly confident explorations. "She's sharing their progress with you," Dr. Foster concluded after witnessing several of these visits. "It's the closest thing to gratitude I've ever observed in a wild animal." Jack found himself transformed by these continued encounters. The boundaries between observer and participant, between scientific documentation and personal connection, had been permanently altered. He had entered the bear's world briefly during their time of need, and now Ranger was offering him continued glimpses into her world as a gift of reciprocity. Word of the extraordinary relationship between Jack and the bear family spread throughout the scientific community and beyond. Researchers from universities across the country requested permission to review his documentation, leading to publications that challenged conventional understandings of wildlife behavior and cognition. The local forestry service, seeing the educational potential in the story, worked with Jack to develop programs for schools and community groups. Using his photographs and videos, they created materials that taught about black bear behavior, the impacts of climate change on hibernation patterns, and the delicate balance between human intervention and wildlife preservation. Ranger and her cubs became unintentional ambassadors for conservation efforts throughout the region. Their story, told through Jack's remarkable images, connected with people in ways that statistics and warnings never had. Children wrote letters to Ranger Bear. Local businesses raised funds for habitat preservation, and the community developed a new sense of responsibility toward the wilderness in their backyard. For Jack personally, the experience catalyzed unexpected change. The man who had sought isolation found himself regularly speaking to groups of eager students and community members, sharing not just scientific observations, but the emotional journey of connection across species boundaries. His tower, once a retreat from human contact, now occasionally hosted small, carefully managed educational visits. What happened in that cabin wasn't just about saving 3 bears, he explained during one presentation at Riverdale's community center. It was about recognizing intelligence and intention in a wild animal that chose, against all natural instinct, to seek human proximity in a moment of desperate need. That choice challenges everything we think we know about the boundaries between wild and domestic, between human space and animal space. Dr. Foster, who had initially approached the situation with professional skepticism, became one of its most passionate scientific advocates. The cognitive sophistication demonstrated by Ranger's decision-making, seeking appropriate shelter, accepting human assistance, later demonstrating her cub's development, suggests capabilities we've barely begun to understand in wild animals, she told a conference of wildlife biologists. It forces us to reconsider our assumptions about animal consciousness and the potential for cross-species communication. As summer progressed into fall, the visits from Ranger and her growing cubs became less frequent but no less meaningful. Each appearance reminded Jack of the extraordinary trust that had developed between them, a connection neither fully wild nor domesticated, but something unique that honored both human and bear nature. On a crisp October morning, as the Blue Ridge Mountains blazed with autumn color, Jack spotted Ranger and her cubs at the forest edge for what would be their final visit before winter hibernation. The cubs, now substantial in size and confidence, wrestled playfully while their mother watched with the patient alertness characteristic of black bear parenting. Jack observed them through his telephoto lens, capturing images that documented their remarkable growth and development. Scout had grown into a curious and adventurous young bear, often the first to explore new territory. Nova remained more cautious, but showed exceptional climbing skills, already able to scale trees with adult-like efficiency. As if sensing his attention, Ranger looked directly toward the tower where Jack stood. For a long moment, bear and man regarded each other across the distance, connected by months of extraordinary interaction that had changed them both. Then, with deliberate movements, Ranger guided her cubs deeper into the forest, where they would soon find a natural den for their first proper hibernation. Jack lowered his camera, knowing this was likely the last he would see of them until spring, if ever. Wildlife experts had explained that as the cubs matured, Ranger would eventually send them to establish their own territories, while she would return to the natural cycles of wild bear life. The unique circumstances that had brought them together had passed, and nature would now reclaim its normal patterns. Yet something permanent had been established during those winter months in the abandoned cabin, a bridge of understanding that transcended typical human-wildlife relationships. Jack had glimpsed a level of animal intelligence and adaptability that few humans ever witnessed, while Ranger had experienced human compassion that contradicted the natural wariness of her species. In the years that followed, Jack's documentation of this extraordinary encounter became part of wildlife management curriculum throughout the country. The Ranger protocols, established guidelines for the rare circumstances when wildlife rehabilitation and human intervention might appropriately intersect. His photographs hung in museums and research facilities, testament to possibilities for connection across species. Boundaries. Jack himself remained at his fire lookout tower, continuing his dual role as observer and protector of the Blue Ridge wilderness. He never again experienced anything as remarkable as his winter with Ranger and her cubs, but his approach to wildlife had been permanently altered. He understood now that the line between wild and tame was not as absolute as he once believed, that intelligence, intention, and even gratitude might exist in the animal world in ways humans were only beginning to comprehend. Each winter, as snow transformed the mountains into the crystalline landscape that had first brought Ranger to his door, Jack would leave a small offering of honey near the forest edge, not to attract or tame, but as a gesture of respect for the extraordinary bear who had chosen in her moment of greatest vulnerability to trust across the boundaries of species. And occasionally, though perhaps only in his imagination, he would glimpse a black shape at the forest edge, watching his tower with intelligent eyes that knew him not as threat, but as ally. A wild creature that had glimpsed the possibility of connection across the ancient divide between humans and the wilderness they once called home. If this remarkable story of Jack and Ranger touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more extraordinary wildlife encounters that challenge our understanding of the natural world. Share this story with others who believe in the healing power of compassion that transcends boundaries between species. Remember that sometimes the most profound connections happen when we're willing to set aside our assumptions and recognize the intelligence and intention in the wild creatures with whom we share this planet. The journey to the cabin normally, a 15-minute walk, took Jack nearly an hour as he navigated the ice-transformed landscape. Tree branches hung dangerously low, occasionally cracking and falling as their frozen weight became too much to bear. The forest was unnaturally silent, most wildlife still sheltering after the severe storm. The only sounds were the crunch of his cleats breaking through the ice crust and his own measured breathing, visible in clouds of vapor that hung in the frigid air. The trail, usually well-defined even in winter, had disappeared beneath the uniform blanket of ice. Jack navigated by memory and landmarks, a lightning-scarred oak here, a distinctive rock formation there, maintaining constant awareness of his position relative to both tower and cabin. Getting lost in these conditions could be fatal, a reality that kept his senses heightened as he moved carefully through the transformed terrain. Every few minutes, Jack would stop and listen, alert for any sounds that might indicate movement ahead. The strange silence of the forest made him increasingly uneasy. These woods should never be this quiet, even after a storm. It was as if the wildlife had withdrawn deeper than usual, sensing something beyond the ordinary dangers of winter. As he approached the cabin, Jack slowed his pace, alert for any signs of the bear. The structure looked even worse up close. The roof partially caved in on one side, windows long since broken, the wooden walls weathered and rotting. That any animal would choose this as shelter over natural options seemed increasingly bizarre. The cabin had once been a functional ranger station, built in the 1950s when this area had first been incorporated into the park system. Now it stood as little more than a shell, deemed too costly to maintain and too remote to be of practical use. Jack circled the building at a safe distance, studying it from all angles before approaching further. There were no sounds from within, no movement visible through the broken windows. The only indication of the bear's presence was a set of tracks, now partially filled with ice, leading to the sagging door that stood partially ajar. The prints were distinctive, 5-toed pads with claw marks visible even through the ice crust. confirming his identification of an American black bear. Moving as quietly as the crunching ice would allow, Jack approached the cabin's entrance. He readied his tranquilizer gun, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. If the bear was severely injured or aggressive, sedation might be necessary before he could assess its condition properly. The dart gun was loaded with a carefully calculated dose, enough to sedate an average-sized black bear without causing respiratory depression or hypothermia, dangers that were particularly acute in the current conditions. Jack paused at the threshold, listening intently. The silence from within was unnerving. Even an injured bear should make some sound. Breathing, shifting, a response to his approach. The complete silence suggested either the bear had left through some unseen exit or its condition was far worse than he had imagined. "Hello in there," he called softly, wanting to announce his presence rather than startle the animal. There was no response, no sound of movement from within the darkened interior. With growing concern, Jack pushed the door wider with his boot, wincing at the creak of rusted hinges that seemed thunderous in the surrounding silence. A blast of even colder air met him as he entered. The cabin, with its broken windows and partial roof collapse, was actually colder than the outside, where at least the sun provided some warmth. Ice had formed on the interior walls, creating surreal patterns that glittered faintly in the dim light. Debris from the partial roof collapse littered what had once been the main room, creating jagged sculptures of broken wood and ice. The cabin's interior was dim, illuminated only by the grey light filtering through broken windows and the partially collapsed roof. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, Jack saw that the single room was largely empty, save for the remnants of old furniture, a broken table, a rusted wood stove, shelves sagging from the walls. Decades of neglect had reduced what was once a functional workspace to little more than a shell. And there, in the far corner beneath the most intact portion of the roof, lay the bear. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The bear was completely still, curled in what appeared to be a defensive posture, its normally glossy black fur matted with ice and debris. For a terrible moment, he thought he had arrived too late. Then he saw the slight rise and fall of its ribcage, shallow but present. The bear was larger than he had estimated from a distance. A female, he could now tell, probably around 5 or 6 years old, judging by her size and development. Her condition was clearly poor. Even in the dim light, Jack could see that her fur lacked the healthy sheen typical of black bears, and her breathing had the shallow, rapid quality that indicated distress. With extreme caution, Jack moved closer, speaking in low, gentle tones, to alert the bear to his presence. "Easy there, girl. I just want to see if you're okay, not going to hurt you." He kept his voice steady and calm, using the same soothing tones he'd developed when approaching injured wildlife in his capacity as a ranger. The bear's eyes opened, dull with pain, but alert enough to track Jack's movement. Those eyes, normally bright with intelligence and wariness, now seemed clouded, though, "Oh my God," Jack whispered, understanding dawning with stunning clarity. This wasn't just any bear. This was a mother who had given birth prematurely during hibernation, likely disturbed by the unusual weather patterns, and she had done the unthinkable, sought out human structure as shelter for her vulnerable newborns when her natural den had become compromised. Jack's mind raced through everything he knew about black bear reproduction. Females typically entered their dens in late November or early December, giving birth during deep hibernation in January or February. Cubs were born tiny, less than a pound each, blind, nearly hairless, and completely dependent on their mother's warmth and milk. They didn't normally emerge from the den until April or even May, when they had grown enough to navigate the outside world. For this mother to be moving her newborns in January through ice and freezing temperatures, something catastrophic must have happened to her original den. The unusual freeze-thaw cycles might have caused flooding or structural collapse of her natural shelter, forcing an impossible choice. Remain in a compromised den where her cubs would surely die, or risk movement to find new shelter. And in her desperate maternal instinct, she had chosen this abandoned human structure as her best option for their survival. The cubs were incredibly vulnerable. At this stage of development, they couldn't regulate their own body temperature and would die within hours if separated from their mother's warmth. The journey through the freezing temperatures to reach this cabin must have been extraordinarily dangerous for them. That they had survived at all was testament to their mother's determination and protective instincts. Jack studied the mother bear's condition more closely, noting the visible ribs beneath her fur, a sign that her fat reserves were severely depleted. This was especially concerning for a nursing mother, who needed substantial energy stores to produce milk for her cubs. The stress of premature den abandonment, combined with the physical ordeal of relocating her cubs, had clearly pushed her to the limits of endurance. The mother bear's eyes remained fixed on Jack, carrying neither aggression nor fear, but something he could only interpret as exhaustion and resignation. It was a gaze that transcended species, the universal look of a mother who had done everything possible to protect her young and now had nothing left to give. What struck Jack most profoundly was the absence of the typical defensive behavior he would expect from a mother bear with cubs. Every wildlife manual, every ranger training session emphasized the extreme danger of approaching a female bear with young. They were known to be fiercely protective, attacking with little provocation when they perceived a threat to their cubs. Yet this mother watched him with what appeared to be a calm awareness that defied everything he had been taught about wild bear behavior. Jack noticed one of the cubs stirring slightly, making tiny squeaking sounds as it blindly sought its mother's warmth. The bear responded with a gentle movement, shifting to better shelter the cub with her body. The second cub remained motionless, concerning Jack deeply. He needed to get closer to properly assess their condition, but doing so meant moving within striking distance of a mother bear, something that went against every safety protocol he had ever learned or taught. Standing in the cold, abandoned cabin, Jack realized he had crossed a threshold from which there was no easy return. This wasn't a simple case of an injured adult bear that might be left to nature's devices. The presence of the newborn cubs transformed the ethical equation entirely. In that moment, Jack knew this was no longer about a single injured bear. It was about 3 lives hanging in the balance, dependent on the decisions he would make in the coming hours. As he considered his next move, Jack was acutely aware that the standard protocols offered no guidance for this unprecedented situation. He was in uncharted territory, both professionally and ethically. The clock was ticking for this small family, with the cubs' survival measured in hours rather than days if their condition was as precarious as it appeared. With deliberate slowness, Jack lowered himself to a crouch, bringing himself to eye level with the bear, while still maintaining enough distance to react if her demeanor changed. "I need to help you," he said softly, continuing the gentle monologue that seemed to keep the bear calm, "but we're going to have to trust each other." From his pack, Jack withdrew a container of honey he had brought as possible bear bait, now repurposed as a potential offering. He placed it on the floor and slid it toward the bear with his gloved hand. The sweet scent filled the cold air, and the bear's nostrils flared slightly, showing the first real sign of interest since he had entered the cabin. To Jack's surprise, the bear made no move toward the honey. Instead, she nudged one of her cubs gently, as if drawing his attention to its condition. The message couldn't have been clearer if she had spoken. The cubs were her priority, not her own needs. "Your babies first, I understand," Jack murmured, moving closer with cautious respect. "Let me see them." He inched forward on his knees, moving with exaggerated slowness, speaking continuously in low, soothing tones. The tranquilizer gun remained within reach, but untouched. Sedating the mother would leave the cubs without vital warmth and potentially compromise her already weakened condition. When he was within arm's reach, close enough that he could feel the bear's labored breath, Jack paused, allowing her time to adjust to his proximity. Her eyes never left his face, watching with an intelligence that seemed to evaluate his intentions. In that moment of connection, Jack felt something profound, a recognition that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild animal. With utmost gentleness, Jack reached toward the cubs. The mother tensed slightly but made no aggressive move, allowing him to carefully touch the smaller, motionless cub. Its tiny body was cool to the touch, dangerously so. Cubs this young needed constant warmth, and this one's temperature had dropped to concerning levels. "This little one's in trouble," Jack said softly, as much to himself as to the mother. "We need to warm him up." Over the next hour, Jack worked with focused intensity, building a small, controlled fire in the old wood stove using dry kindling he had brought in his pack. The smoke vented poorly through the damaged chimney, but the added warmth began to transform the cabin's frigid interior. He spread his emergency blanket on the floor near the stove, creating a warmer space away from the drafts that infiltrated the cabin's broken windows. The critical moment came when Jack needed to move the bear family closer to this warmth. Rather than attempting to handle the cubs, an action that might trigger the protective instincts that had been mysteriously dormant so far, he prepared the space and then retreated, allowing the mother bear to make the decision. "There's warmth. Over here," he said, gesturing toward the makeshift nest. "It's better for your cubs." To Jack's amazement, after a long moment of apparent consideration, the bear rose shakily to her feet. Gathering one cub gently in her mouth, the traditional carrying method for bear mothers, she moved slowly toward the warm space Jack had created. She placed the cub carefully on the blanket, then returned for the second, weaker one. Her movements were labored, betraying her own exhaustion and physical distress. Once both cubs were settled in the warmer location, the mother bear collapsed beside them, her energy visibly depleted by even this small exertion. Her breathing was more labored now, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. Jack recognized the signs of severe metabolic stress. Her body, which should have been in hibernation with ample fat reserves, was now running on empty while trying to produce milk for her cubs. With the immediate crisis of cold addressed, Jack turned his attention to hydration and nutrition. He melted snow in a collapsible container over the small fire, adding honey and salt to create a crude electrolyte solution. Offering it to the mother bear required another leap of trust. He would need to approach with the container while she was awake and alert. "Just some water with energy," he explained, the habit of speaking to her now feeling natural despite its absurdity. He placed the container within her reach and backed away, giving her space to decide. The bear sniffed the liquid cautiously, then began to lap at it with her large tongue. She drank slowly at first, then with increasing eagerness, emptying the container. Jack refilled it twice more, each time approaching and retreating with deliberate care, maintaining the delicate trust that was developing between them. As the mother hydrated, Jack turned his attention to the cubs. With exquisite caution, and always under the watchful eye of their mother, he examined each tiny body. The larger cub, which he mentally dubbed Scout for its slightly more active demeanor, responded well to the increased warmth, making small movements and nursing sounds. The smaller cub, Nova, he decided, for the star-like white patch on its tiny chest, concerned him more. Its responses were minimal, its small body still cooler than it should be. With the mother's apparent permission, Jack gently massaged the tiny cub, stimulating circulation in the same way a mother bear would lick her cubs to encourage blood flow. "Come on, little one," he murmured, working with the gentlest touch possible on the delicate body that fit easily in his palms. "Your mom brought you all this way. Don't give up now." As if responding to his encouragement, the tiny cub gave a weak squeak and made a feeble pawing motion. The mother bear immediately shifted position, presenting her belly to allow the cubs access to nurse. It was a critical moment. If the cubs could nurse successfully, their chances of survival would increase dramatically. Jack watched with bated breath as the cubs, guided by instinct and their mother's gentle nudging, found their way to nurse. Even the weaker cub latched on, drawing the vital nutrition that only its mother could provide. The simple biological miracle of it, this primal connection between mother and offspring that transcended the desperate circumstances, brought unexpected moisture to Jack's eyes. As night fell, turning the cabin into a realm of deep shadows, broken only by the gentle glow of the small fire, Jack faced a decision. Attempting to return to his tower in darkness across the treacherous, ice-covered terrain would be foolhardy. Yet spending the night in close quarters with a wild bear family, no matter how docile they currently appeared, contradicted every safety principle he had ever been taught. In the end, the decision was made for him when the smaller cub, Nova, began showing signs of distress again, its tiny body struggling to maintain the warmth it had briefly gained. Jack couldn't leave, not when the next few hours might determine whether this small family survived intact. He settled in the corner farthest from the bears, maintaining a respectful distance while still close enough to tend the fire and monitor their condition. He unfolded his second emergency blanket, wrapping it around himself against the persistent cold that crept through the cabin's many breaches. The mother bear watched him with those intelligent eyes, seemingly understanding that he had chosen to remain as guardian through the dangerous night. "We'll get through till morning," Jack told her softly. "Then I'll figure out next steps." The night passed in cycles of wakefulness and brief, fitful sleep for both human and bear. Jack rose every hour to add fuel to the small fire, each time checking on the cub's condition. By dawn, he was exhausted, but heartened to see both cubs nursing more vigorously, their tiny bodies noticeably warmer and more active. The mother bear, however, showed increasing signs of distress. Her breathing remained labored, and Jack noticed a concerning tremor in her limbs when she shifted position. She needed substantial nutrition to produce milk for her growing cubs, far more than the honey water mixture he had provided. With the first light of dawn filtering through the broken windows, Jack prepared to make the journey back to his tower for additional supplies. The small family needed proper food, better insulation against the cold, and medical supplies if they were to survive. The mother bear's condition, in particular, required intervention beyond what he could provide with his limited emergency pack. Before leaving, Jack built up the fire with the remaining kindling and positioned his backpack as a windbreak to protect the small family from the draft that cut through the cabin's broken windows. The mother bear watched these preparations with apparent understanding, her eyes following his movements around the cabin. "I'm coming back," Jack promised as he prepared to depart. "Just a few hours, and I'll bring what you need." As if acknowledging his words, the mother bear made a soft huffing sound, not the warning huff he was familiar with from bear encounters, but something almost conversational. In that moment, Jack felt the connection between them solidify into something extraordinary, a bridge of trust between species that defied conventional understanding. The journey back to the tower was marginally easier in daylight, though the ice remained treacherous. Jack moved with purposeful haste, his mind already inventorying the supplies he would need to gather. High-calorie food appropriate for a lactating bear, medical supplies for potential infection or injury, materials to better seal the cabin against the penetrating cold. Upon reaching the tower, Jack immediately attempted radio contact with the ranger station, hoping communications had been restored overnight. To his relief, he was able to make brief, static-filled contact with Marcus Hendricks, the local forest ranger captain. "Jack, we've been trying to reach you." Marcus's voice crackled through the static. "Storm damage is extensive. Roads are still impassable to your sector." "Marcus, I need a wildlife vet consult urgently," Jack replied, keeping his explanation concise to preserve the tenuous connection. Female black bear with newborn cubs, severely malnourished, possible hypothermia in the cubs. They're sheltering in the old North Ridge cabin. There was a long pause before Marcus responded, his voice carrying clear surprise even through the poor connection. Bears should be hibernating this time of year, and a mother with newborns wouldn't leave her den. "I know the protocols, Marcus. This is different. Den probably compromised by the storm. She brought the cubs to the cabin deliberately." Jack hesitated, then added the detail that would underscore the unprecedented nature of the situation. "She's allowing human proximity. I was with them all night, providing warmth and hydration." The silence that followed conveyed Marcus's shock more effectively than words could have. When he finally responded, his tone had shifted from surprised to concerned. "Jack, that's extremely dangerous. Mother bears with cubs are—" "I know what the manuals say," Jack interrupted. "This isn't in any manual. I need you to patch me through to Dr. Elena Foster if possible, and I need an emergency supply drop if you can get a helicopter into the sector." The radio crackled with static for several moments before Marcus replied. "Dr. Foster is actually here at base camp, coordinating wildlife response to the storm. I'll have her contact you directly. As for the supply drop, no aircraft until this afternoon at earliest, and that's weather dependent." "Tell her it's urgent," Jack emphasized. "I'm heading back to the cabin with whatever supplies I can carry from here. Have her call on this frequency in 1 hour." After ending the transmission, Jack moved with efficient purpose around his tower, gathering everything that might help the bear family survive. He filled his largest backpack with high-protein foods, canned salmon, peanut butter, his emergency supply of beef jerky, along with first aid supplies, more blankets and tools to better seal the cabin's broken windows. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the extraordinary behavior of the mother bear. Everything in his training and experience said that a female with cubs should be aggressively defensive, yet she had allowed him not only to approach, but to handle her cubs and remain in close proximity overnight. It defied explanation within the conventional understanding of bear behavior. Jack remembered a conversation with Dr. Foster during a wildlife management seminar the previous year. She had mentioned research suggesting that black bears possessed cognitive abilities far beyond what had traditionally been recognized, problem-solving skills, long-term memory, and complex social understanding that approached primate levels in some contexts. "We're only beginning to understand their intelligence," she had said. "Most of what we know about bear behavior comes from observing them in threatening situations or brief encounters. We rarely see how they might behave in sustained, non-threatening interactions with humans." Was that what was happening in the cabin? Had the mother bear somehow recognized his intention to help, making a calculated decision to tolerate human presence for the survival of her cubs? The implications were staggering from both scientific and ethical perspectives. By the time Jack had gathered everything he could reasonably carry, an hour had nearly passed. He adjusted the radio to receive an incoming call and continued his preparations while waiting for Dr. Foster to contact him. The radio crackled to life just as he was sealing his pack. "Jack Thornton, this is Dr. Elena Foster." Marcus filled me in on your situation. "I need specific details about the bear's condition." Jack was relieved to hear the veterinarian's voice, free of the judgment or skepticism he had half expected. Dr. Foster had a reputation for prioritizing animal welfare above protocol, which made her the perfect ally in this unprecedented situation. Female black bear, approximately 6 years old judging by size and development. Severely underweight, likely from interrupted hibernation. 2 newborn cubs, probably no more than days old. One stronger, one weaker, with possible hypothermia. All 3 showing signs of exhaustion and stress, but the mother is allowing human assistance. She's maintaining enough milk production to nurse the cubs, but her condition is deteriorating. Location? Dr. Foster asked concisely. The old Northridge cabin. She brought the cubs there herself, after her den was likely compromised in the storm. I found her yesterday, and stayed overnight to provide warmth and hydration. There was a pause before Dr. Foster responded, her professional demeanor momentarily broken by obvious astonishment. She allowed you to remain overnight with newborn. Cubs present, that's... She stopped, then continued more professionally. What interventions have you provided so far? Jack detailed his actions. The fire for warmth, the honey water solution for hydration, the gentle massage of the weaker cub to stimulate circulation. He could almost hear Dr. Foster taking notes on the other end of the connection. You've done well with limited resources, she said finally. Here's what we need to prioritize. The mother needs high-calorie nutrition immediately, proteins and fats primarily. The cubs need stable warmth above all else. If the weaker cub can't maintain body temperature, continuous physical contact with either the mother or a heat source is critical. She continued with specific instructions for assessing hydration, checking for injuries he might have missed in the dim light, and monitoring nursing frequency. Jack committed each detail to memory, respect growing for the veterinarian's precise knowledge, and lack of recrimination for his unorthodox intervention. I've convinced Marcus to prioritize your location for helicopter supply drop once weather permits, Dr. Foster concluded. I'll be on board personally. Until then, your presence is that family's best chance for survival. Document everything you observe. This situation is unprecedented and potentially invaluable for understanding bear cognition and behavior. Approximate ETA? Jack asked, already calculating how long his gathered supplies might last. 18 to 24 hours at best, she replied grimly. The storm damaged more than just your sector. We're coordinating multiple wildlife emergencies across the region. Do what you can with what you have and maintain radio contact every 4 hours. As Jack ended the transmission and hoisted his heavily laden pack, he felt the dual weight of responsibility and isolation. For the next day at least, he alone stood between this bear family and almost certain death. The professional detachment he had cultivated through years of wildlife observation had been irrevocably breached, replaced by a personal investment in their survival that went beyond scientific interest or conservation duty. The return journey to the cabin took longer. His pace slowed by the heavy pack and the need to protect the fragile supplies it contained. Ice had begun to melt in exposed areas where the strengthening sun reached, creating deceptively slick surfaces that threatened treacherous falls. Jack moved with methodical care, knowing that injury to himself would doom not just one life, but 3. As he approached the cabin, a new fear gripped him. What if the mother bear had abandoned the relative safety of the shelter, attempting to move her cubs again in his absence? What if predators, attracted by the scent of vulnerable cubs, had discovered the cabin's inhabitants? The possibilities multiplied in his mind, each more concerning than the last. Relief washed over him when he finally reached the cabin and found the small family exactly where he had left them. The mother bear raised her head at his entrance, her eyes showing what Jack could only interpret as recognition. The cubs were nursing, both showing more activity than when he had departed, a positive sign that their condition was at least stabilizing. "Brought you some real food," Jack said softly, resuming the one-sided conversation that had become natural despite its apparent absurdity. "And some ways to make this place warmer." Over the next several hours, Jack transformed the abandoned cabin into a functional shelter for the unique needs of its inhabitants. He used plastic sheeting from his supplies to cover the broken windows, reducing the biting draft that had continuously sapped warmth from the small space. The wood stove, cleaned of decades of debris, now burned more efficiently with the dry firewood he had carried from the tower. Most importantly, he created a proper feeding station for the mother bear, offering small portions of high-calorie foods at regular intervals. Her initial hesitation gave way to eager consumption as her body's desperate need for nutrition overcame any remaining wariness. The salmon was particularly well received, disappearing in large, hungry bites that reminded Jack of the power those jaws normally represented. Between these practical tasks, Jack maintained detailed notes in his field journal, documenting every behavior, feeding response, and interaction with scientific precision. If they survived this ordeal, the record of this unprecedented situation would provide invaluable data for understanding bear behavior and intelligence. If they didn't, well, at least there would be an account of what had been attempted. As night fell once more, the cabin had been transformed from a precarious shelter to a space that offered genuine protection from the elements. The temperature inside had risen significantly, creating a warm zone around the stove where the bear family now rested comfortably. Jack had created his own space several feet away, close enough to monitor and assist, but still maintaining the respectful distance that seemed appropriate to their evolving relationship. In the flickering firelight, Jack studied the mother bear as she tended to her cubs. Her movements were more fluid now, her breathing less labored, signs that the nutrition was already having positive effects. The cubs were noticeably more active, making the small, squeaking sounds that indicated healthy development at their age. As he watched this intimate family scene, Jack was struck by the extraordinary privilege he was experiencing. Few humans ever witnessed black bear cubs at this early stage of development. Their time in the den was one of nature's private moments, shielded from observation by the mother's protective instincts and the inaccessibility of typical den sites. Yet, here he was, not merely observing, but participating in their care during this vulnerable period. The mother bear seemed increasingly comfortable with his presence, watching him with what appeared to be growing trust rather than mere tolerance. When he approached to add wood to the fire or offer more food, she remained calm, her body language relaxed in a way that contradicted everything Jack knew about wild bear behavior, especially mothers with cubs. As the long night progressed, Jack maintained his 4-hour radio check-ins with base camp, reporting the family's improving condition and receiving updates on the planned supply drop. Weather conditions remained marginal for helicopter operations, pushing the estimated arrival time further into the following day. Dr. Foster, in their last communication, had emphasized the importance of maintaining the mother's nutrition above all else. Without adequate caloric intake, her milk production would fail, dooming the cubs regardless of other interventions. Jack rationed his supplies carefully, prioritizing the mother's needs while ensuring he maintained enough strength himself to continue providing care. The delicate balance of their survival now depended on this careful resource management until professional help arrived. During the quiet hours between radio calls, as the mother bear dozed and her cubs nursed, Jack found himself reflecting on the extraordinary sequence of events that had brought them together. Traditional wildlife management emphasized maintaining distance, allowing natural processes to unfold without human interference. Yet here he was, deeply entangled in the survival struggle of this small bear family, crossing boundaries that his training had established as inviolable. What struck him most was the deliberate nature of the mother bear's actions. She hadn't randomly stumbled upon the cabin in desperate wandering. Her tracks had shown a direct approach, as if she had known exactly where she was going. Had she been aware of the cabin's existence from previous explorations of her territory? Had she somehow understood it offered better shelter than natural alternatives? The level of decision-making. Such choices would require challenged conventional understanding of bear cognition. More remarkable still was her apparent recognition of human capacity to help. Rather than displaying the defensive aggression typical of mother bears, she had allowed his approach, accepted his assistance, and now seemed to be actively cooperating in their shared goal of keeping her cubs alive. It suggested a level of situational assessment and adaptive behavior that went far beyond instinct. As dawn approached on the second day of this extraordinary intervention, Jack noticed a subtle change in the mother bear's behavior. She became more alert, her ears swiveling toward the cabin door before Jack himself heard anything. Moments later, he detected the distant sound that had captured her attention, the faint thrum of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, echoing across the frozen landscape. The mother bear tensed visibly, her body shifting to shield her cubs from the unknown threat. Jack moved slowly to the cabin door, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle her. "It's okay," he said softly, maintaining the calm, steady voice he'd been using with her. "That's help arriving." Through the cabin's frost-covered window, Jack could see the Forestry Service helicopter descending toward a small clearing about a quarter-mile away, the nearest suitable landing zone to the cabin. The sight filled him with profound relief. Professional help was finally arriving, bringing proper medical supplies and expertise that could make the difference for this small family. Jack knew he needed to prepare the mother bear for the arrival of strangers, a potentially dangerous moment that could undo the fragile trust they had established. Moving with deliberate calm, he crouched down to her eye level, speaking in the same soothing tones that had become their form of communication. "More people are coming to help your cubs," he explained, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping his calm demeanor would reassure her. "They might seem scary, but they're here to help just like I am." The mother bear watched him with those intelligent eyes, her ears still tracking the helicopter sounds even as her gaze remained fixed on Jack. She made no aggressive moves, though her body remained protectively positioned between her cubs and the door. The trust they had established was about to face its greatest test. Jack made his way carefully outside, wanting to intercept Dr. Foster and brief her before she approached the cabin. The mid-morning sun had partially melted the ice coating the landscape, creating a treacherous mix of slick surfaces and deceptive slush. He navigated cautiously, keeping the cabin in sight while moving toward the landing zone. Dr. Elena Foster was already disembarking when Jack reached the clearing, directing the unloading of equipment and supplies with efficient precision. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical braid beneath a Forestry Service cap. Her reputation as one of the region's most experienced wildlife veterinarians was well-earned, with over 20 years of field work in some of the most challenging conditions. She spotted Jack approaching and moved to meet him, her expression a mixture of professional concern and barely concealed scientific curiosity. "Jack Thornton, I'm Elena Foster." "Thanks for coming so quickly," Jack replied, helping her shoulder a heavy medical pack. "The situation inside is, well, it's unlike anything I've encountered before." "Your radio reports suggested as much," Dr. Foster nodded, gesturing for her assistant to follow with additional equipment. "A mother black bear with newborns, allowing human proximity. It contradicts everything in the literature." "It goes beyond allowing proximity," Jack explained as they began the careful journey toward the cabin. "She's actively cooperating, taking food from my hand, permitting me to handle the cubs. making eye contact in a way that feels almost communicative. It's as if she understands I'm trying to help. Dr. Foster's expression remained professionally neutral, but her pace quickened slightly. Let's not make assumptions about cognition until I've observed her behavior directly. Bears are intelligent opportunists. Her tolerance might be simple risk calculation rather than understanding. As they approached the cabin, Jack paused, turning to face Dr. Foster and her assistant directly. Before we go in, you need to understand. This isn't a standard wildlife intervention where we can just tranquilize and transport. She's chosen this shelter, brought her cubs here deliberately. I think we need to respect that choice. Dr. Foster studied him for a long moment before responding. 25 years in wildlife medicine has taught me one thing above all, Thornton. Each animal is an individual, not just a representative of its species. I'll assess the situation without preconceptions. She gestured to her assistant, a young man who'd been silently observing their exchange. This is Mike Chen, my field technician. He'll follow our lead. Jack nodded, satisfied with her response. Let me enter first. She knows me now. When she's comfortable, I'll signal you to come in. Move slowly, speak softly, and avoid direct eye contact initially. The interior of the cabin felt almost warm after the biting cold outside, the small wood stove having maintained a steady heat overnight. The mother bear was alert but calm, watching the door with focused attention as Jack entered. Her cubs were active now, making small movements against her fur as they sought warmth and milk. I brought friends, Jack said softly, moving to his now familiar position several feet from the bear family. They're going to help us make sure your cubs are healthy. He gestured toward the door, and Dr. Foster entered with measured steps, her experienced gaze immediately assessing the scene before her. Mike followed, carefully carrying equipment cases that he set down with deliberate gentleness. Dr. Foster's professional demeanor faltered momentarily as she took in the remarkable scene. A wild black bear with newborn cubs, allowing human presence. In close proximity, without signs of aggression or fear. Her eyes widened, a scientist witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions in her field. Extraordinary, she whispered before regaining her composure. Jack, continue speaking. To her as you've been doing. She's associated your voice with safety. For the next hour, Dr. Foster conducted a careful assessment of the bear family, moving with the slow deliberation of an experienced wildlife veterinarian. She directed Jack to maintain his position of trust, using him as an intermediary whenever possible. The mother bear watched the newcomers warily but without aggression, seemingly taking cues from Jack's relaxed demeanor. The cubs are remarkably healthy considering the circumstances, Dr. Foster reported after examining them with gentle hands while the mother watched attentively. The smaller one, Nova you called it, shows signs of mild hypothermia but has improved significantly with the warmth you've provided. Scout is developing normally for his age. And the mother? Jack asked, noting that the bear was showing signs of fatigue after the excitement of new arrivals. Dr. Foster's expression grew more serious. She's severely malnourished. Interrupted hibernation has depleted her fat reserves when she most needs them for lactation. I'm also detecting signs of infection, possibly from a wound sustained during the den collapse or their journey here. Can you treat her? Yes, but it complicates our options. Dr. Foster moved away from the bear family, gesturing for Jack to join her near the door where they could speak more privately. Standard protocol would be to tranquilize, transport to a wildlife rehabilitation facility and treat under controlled conditions. But with cubs this young and her unusual behavior, I'm hesitant to interrupt the bond they've formed. Mike joined, them speaking for the first time. What about stabilizing them here? The helicopter brought enough supplies to convert this into a field treatment station. Dr. Foster considered this, her gaze returning to the bear family. It's unorthodox, but so is this entire situation. The cubs are too young to be hand-raised without significant risk, and the mother's behavior suggests this location represents safety to her. She nodded decisively. We'll establish a field hospital here for initial treatment, then reassess in 48 hours. With that decision made, the cabin transformed into a hive of focused activity. Mike returned to the helicopter for additional supplies, while Dr. Foster prepared medications for the mother bear, antibiotics to combat infection, nutritional supplements to support milk production, and mild pain relievers to address the discomfort that had been evident in her movements. Administering these treatments presented a unique challenge. Normally, medicating a wild bear required sedation or, at minimum, significant restraint. In this extraordinary case, Dr. Foster opted for a different approach, using the trust Jack had established as a foundation. We'll hide the medications in high-value foods, she explained, preparing a mixture of honey, salmon, and crushed pills. Her hunger should override any hesitation about the unusual taste. Jack took the prepared mixture, approaching the mother. Bear with the same calm confidence he had developed over their time together. Medicine to help you feel better, he explained, holding the food mixture toward her. It will help you make milk for your cubs. The mother bear sniffed the offering cautiously, her intelligent eyes moving from the food to Jack's face as if assessing his intentions. After a moment of apparent consideration, she accepted the medicated mixture, consuming it completely while maintaining eye contact with Jack. The level of apparent understanding in that gaze sent a chill down Jack's spine. It felt impossibly like communication between species. Dr. Foster watched this interaction with barely concealed amazement. In 25 years of wildlife medicine, I've never seen anything like this, she admitted quietly. The trust she's showing contradicts everything we understand about wild bear behavior, especially mothers with newborn cubs. Maybe we don't understand as much as we think we do, Jack suggested, still maintaining eye contact with the bear as she finished the medicated food. As evening approached, the cabin had been transformed into a functional wildlife field hospital. The broken windows were properly sealed with materials from the helicopter, insulating the space against the bitter cold. A more efficient heating system had replaced Jack's makeshift wood stove arrangement, maintaining a steady temperature ideal for the recovering cubs. Food, medical supplies, and monitoring equipment now filled the once sparse space. A rotating schedule was established. Jack, Dr. Foster, and Mike would take shifts maintaining a human presence in the cabin, ensuring continuous monitoring while allowing for rest periods. The helicopter pilot had returned to base, but would be available for emergency evacuation or additional supply runs, as needed. During a quiet moment as dusk fell, Dr. Foster reviewed her notes, while Jack maintained his now familiar position near the bear family. I've decided to name her, she said suddenly, looking up from her documentation, for the records. What did you choose? Jack asked, curious about the normally protocol-focused veterinarian's departure from scientific detachment. Ranger, Dr. Foster replied with a small smile. It seems fitting, given her choice of a ranger cabin for shelter, and it acknowledges your role in this unusual situation. Jack nodded, feeling the rightness of the name. Ranger it is then, Ranger and her cubs, Scout and Nova. As if responding to her new name, the mother bear, Ranger, raised her head, her dark eyes meeting Jack's with that unsettling intelligence. Dr. Foster inhaled sharply, witnessing the moment of apparent recognition. The more I observe her, the more questions I have about bear cognition, she admitted, setting aside her clinical notes. The deliberate choice of human structure for shelter, the acceptance of human proximity despite having newborns, the apparent understanding of our intentions. It challenges fundamental assumptions about wildlife behavior. What will happen to them after they recover? Jack asked, voicing the question that had been growing in his mind as he became increasingly invested in this small family's future. Dr. Foster's expression grew more guarded. That's where things get complicated. Protocol would dictate minimal human contact to prevent habituation, followed by release back into suitable habitat once the cubs are old enough to travel safely. But this situation has already gone far beyond protocol, Jack pointed out. Ranger has already demonstrated behavior that defies classification as either wild or habituated. She's something in between, which is precisely what makes this case so challenging from a wildlife management perspective. Dr. Foster agreed. We're in uncharted territory. The decisions we make here could have implications for how we understand the relationship between humans and wildlife, particularly apex predators like bears. Their conversation was interrupted by a low, huffing sound from Ranger, who had shifted, positioned to allow her cubs better access for nursing. The small family created a tableau of natural intimacy that seemed strangely at odds with the clinical equipment surrounding them. Wild nature enclosed within a human framework, neither fully one nor the other. As night settled fully over the mountains, the cabin became a small island of warmth and activity in the vast, frozen wilderness. Mike took the first monitoring shift, allowing Jack and Dr. Foster to rest after their long day. Jack found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, his mind cycling through the extraordinary events that had brought him to this moment. He had come to these mountains seeking solitude and the chance to observe wildlife from a respectful distance. Now, he found himself intimately involved in the survival of a bear family, crossing boundaries between wild and tame that he had once believed sacrosanct. The experience was transforming his understanding of his role as a ranger and wildlife photographer, challenging the very foundations of his relationship with the natural world. Dr. Foster seemed to sense his wakefulness in the darkness. "It changes you, doesn't it?" she said softly from her nearby cot. "When you cross that line from observer to participant in a wild animal's life." "Yes," Jack admitted, grateful for her understanding. "I've spent years documenting wildlife without interference, believing that was the most respectful approach. But this," he gestured toward where Ranger and her cubs rested under Mike's watchful eye, "this feels like a different kind of respect. Recognition of individual need over abstract principle. The challenge is knowing when that crossing is appropriate," Dr. Foster replied thoughtfully. "When intervention serves the greater good versus when it merely satisfies our human desire to help or connect." She paused, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "Early in my career, I was strictly by the book. Minimal intervention, natural consequences, maintain the wild in wildlife at all costs. Experience has taught me that reality is messier than our neat ethical frameworks." Their conversation drifted into philosophical territory as the night deepened. The nature of wildness in an increasingly human-dominated world, the capacity for cross-species understanding, the balance between scientific detachment and compassionate engagement. Through it all, Ranger remained a quiet presence in the cabin, occasionally shifting position or tending to her cubs, but always with an awareness of the humans sharing her temporary shelter. Dawn brought renewed activity as Dr. Foster conducted another assessment of the bear family's condition. The improvement was remarkable after just one day of proper nutrition and medication. Ranger's eyes were brighter, her movements more fluid, showing less of the painful stiffness that had characterized her earlier behavior. The cubs were noticeably more active, their small bodies plumping as their mother's milk production improved with better nutrition. The antibiotics are working effectively against the infection, Dr. Foster reported, completing her examination. And her vital signs are stabilizing. The cubs are developing normally for their age, now that their environment is stable. The positive medical news was tempered by practical concerns as the small team gathered for a planning discussion. Weather reports indicated another storm system approaching from the west, likely to reach their location within 48 hours. The potential for being stranded at the cabin for an extended period needed to be factored into their decisions. We have supplies for approximately 5 days, Mike calculated, inventorying their resources. Possibly a week if we're conservative. The helicopter could make one more supply run before the storm hits, but after that, we'd be isolated until weather clears. Dr. Foster considered their options. Her clinical pragmatism balanced against the unique nature of their situation. The ideal scenario would be to transport them to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center before the storm. It's equipped for long-term care of cubs this young. She paused, looking toward Ranger, who was watching their discussion with apparent interest. But transport requires sedation, which carries risks for both mother and cubs in their condition. What about maintaining the field hospital here through the storm? Jack suggested. The cabin is secure now. We have heat and supplies, and Ranger has chosen this location herself. It respects her agency in the situation. The mention of agency raised Dr. Foster's eyebrows. That's an interesting choice of words, Thornton. Agency implies cognitive decision-making, consciousness of choices and their implications. It's not a term we typically apply to wildlife. Look at her, Jack replied simply, gesturing toward Ranger. She isn't behaving based on instinct alone. She chose this shelter, accepted our help, cooperates with treatment. If that isn't agency, what would you call it? Before Dr. Foster could respond, the radio crackled with an incoming transmission from base camp. Marcus Hendricks, the forest ranger captain, was requesting an update and consultation about next steps. Dr. Foster took the call in the cabin doorway, outlining the situation in clinical terms, while Jack and Mike continued monitoring Ranger and her cubs. When she returned, her expression was troubled. Management is concerned about resource allocation. With the approaching storm, they're prioritizing human safety operations and want us to evacuate within 24 hours. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Not convinced this situation warrants the level of intervention. We're providing. Jack felt a surge of protective indignation. Not warranted? We're talking about 3 lives that would have been lost without intervention, lives that still depend on our continued care. I understand your position, Dr. Foster replied calmly, and I share your assessment of the situation's importance. But from a wildlife management perspective, the resources being devoted to a single bear family could be directed toward broader conservation efforts affecting larger populations. So, we're supposed to just abandon them? Jack's voice rose slightly, causing Ranger to lift her head in alert attention. He immediately modulated his tone, aware of how the bear responded to emotional cues. After establishing this care, gaining her trust, making promises with our actions if not our words, Dr. Foster studied him for a long moment. You've become deeply invested in this family's survival, haven't you? Beyond professional interest or conservation ethics. Jack couldn't deny it. The hours spent in close proximity with Ranger and her cubs, witnessing their vulnerability and remarkable resilience, had created a connection he hadn't anticipated. What had begun as an unusual wildlife intervention had become something more personal, a relationship of mutual trust and dependency that defied conventional categories. Yes, he admitted, but that doesn't make the ethical question any less valid. We've intervened in their lives, created a situation of dependency. Don't we have a responsibility to see it through? Dr. Foster nodded slowly. We do. which is why I've requested permission to remain at the cabin with minimal support. Through the storm, Marcus wasn't pleased, but he acknowledged my authority in wildlife medical decisions. She turned to Mike. You'll evacuate with the helicopter tomorrow, taking our data and samples for analysis. Jack and I will continue care here until the cubs are strong enough to consider transport options. The decision struck Jack as the right compromise between practical constraints and ethical responsibility. It would allow for continued professional care while minimizing resource demands on the forestry service during the approaching storm emergency. With the immediate future decided, the team focused on preparing for an extended period of isolation. The helicopter would make one final supply delivery before the storm, bringing additional food, medical supplies, and communication equipment to maintain contact with base camp, even if power systems failed. Throughout these preparations, Ranger maintained her now familiar watchful attention, tracking their movements around the cabin with intelligent eyes. Her cubs, growing stronger by the hour, had begun to show more distinct personalities. Scout, more adventurous, attempting short crawling explorations when awake. Nova, more cautious, staying closer to her mother's protective presence. As evening approached, bringing with it the first advance clouds of the coming storm, Jack found himself documenting these developments with meticulous attention. His photographs and notes were evolving beyond scientific observation into something more narrative, the unfolding story of a unique relationship between species traditionally separated by mutual wariness. Dr. Foster joined him as he reviewed his documentation. You should consider publishing this experience when it's complete, she suggested, not just in scientific journals, though the behavioral observations are certainly valuable there, but for a broader audience as well. It challenges our assumptions about the boundaries between wild and human spheres. Jack considered this, watching as Ranger gently groomed her cubs in the warm glow of the cabin's lighting. I've always tried to maintain professional distance in my wildlife work. This feels more personal somehow. The best scientific work often comes from that intersection of professional observation and personal connection, Dr. Foster replied. As long as you maintain the rigor and honesty in your documentation, the personal element adds depth rather than distortion. Their conversation was interrupted by a low, rumbling sound from outside, not thunder, but the deeper vibration of heavy machinery on the move. Jack moved to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk with a sense of foreboding. Through the trees, he could make out the unmistakable outline of a Forestry Service all-terrain vehicle approaching the cabin, an unexpected arrival that had not been part of their communications plan. Were we expecting additional personnel? He asked, turning to Dr. Foster with concern. Her expression mirrored his own unease. No, all authorized movements were supposed to be coordinated through me. She moved to the door, stepping outside, to assess the situation while Jack remained with Ranger and the cubs. Through the cabin's thin walls, Jack could hear Dr. Foster's voice, raised in what sounded like a heated discussion. Ranger sensed the tension, her body language shifting subtly. From relaxed to alert, her attention fixed on the door. Jack moved closer to the Bear family, instinctively positioning himself between them and whatever conflict was developing outside. When Dr. Foster returned, her face was tight with controlled anger. We have a situation. Regional director sent a wildlife extraction team without consulting me. They're under orders to tranquilize and transport the Bear family to the main wildlife center immediately before the storm hits. That's too dangerous in their condition, Jack protested, keeping his voice low and calm despite his alarm. The cubs are too young for transport stress, and Ranger's barely stabilized from her infection. I made that point forcefully, Dr. Foster replied grimly, was overruled. Apparently some photos Mike sent to document our work have circulated among administration. They're concerned about unnatural habituation and want the situation contained before it becomes a potential liability. The irony was bitter. The very trust that had allowed them to help Ranger and her cubs without dangerous sedation was now being interpreted as a threat, a deviation from wild behavior that needed to be corrected through conventional management. Jack felt a wave of protective determination. They can't just undo everything we've established here. Ranger chose this location. She's trusting us with her cubs' care. Forcing transport now could kill them all. Dr. Foster nodded, her professional composure momentarily broken by genuine emotion. I know. That's why I asked for an hour to prepare proper transport protocols and appropriate sedation doses. She lowered her voice further. But I'm not planning to use that hour for preparation, Jack. I'm giving you a choice. She outlined her proposal quickly, aware that time was limited. The extraction team had agreed to give her the requested hour based on her professional reputation, but they would proceed with or without her cooperation after that. The choice she offered was stark in its implications. Comply with the extraction order, potentially risking the bear family's health or even survival, or implement an alternative plan that would directly contravene professional protocols and possibly even regulations. Jack listened, understanding the gravity of the decision before him. His career as a ranger, his professional standing in the wildlife community, potentially even legal consequences, all hung in the balance against the welfare of Ranger and her cubs. The rational part of his mind argued for compliance, for working within the system to ensure the best possible standard care during transport. But as he looked at Ranger, this remarkable bear who had defied natural instincts to seek human shelter, who had displayed trust and intelligence beyond conventional understanding of her species, he knew what his decision would be. Some boundaries, once crossed, could not be retraced. He had promised this bear family his protection, if not in words, then in actions, and he would honor that promise regardless of professional consequences. I understand the implications, he told Dr. Foster quietly, but I can't be part of forcing them into a dangerous transport situation. Not when we have a functioning care setup here that Ranger herself chose. Dr. Foster's relief was visible. I was hoping you'd say that. I can't officially support this decision. My license and authority require compliance with administrative directives, but I can create a window of opportunity while appearing to cooperate. Their plan took shape quickly, utilizing Dr. Foster's authority to control the immediate situation while creating space for Jack to implement the alternative approach. She would engage the extraction team in detailed preparations, insisting on proper protocols that would naturally extend their timeline. Meanwhile, Jack would prepare Ranger and her cubs for a different solution entirely. As Dr. Foster returned outside to begin her part of the strategy, Jack crouched near Ranger, meeting her intelligent gaze directly. "They want to take you away, from here," he said softly, maintaining the one-sided conversations that had become their form of communication. "It would be dangerous for your cubs. I think you chose this place for a reason, and I'm going to honor that choice." Ranger's dark eyes held his own, that unsettling intelligence seeming to assess his words even if she couldn't understand their specific meaning. One of her cubs, Scout, squeaked softly, squirming against her fur. She broke eye contact to attend to the cub, then looked back at Jack with what he could only interpret as expectation. Working quickly but calmly, Jack gathered the essential supplies they would need: medications, high-calorie food for Ranger, the specialized warming equipment for the cubs, and basic survival gear for himself. Dr. Foster had made clear she couldn't actively assist this plan, but she had accidentally left her medical kit within easy reach, containing medications that would be crucial for Ranger's continued treatment. The alternative shelter had been part of their earlier contingency discussions, a natural cave formation less than a mile deeper into the forest, away from established trails. Jack had documented it years earlier during his wildlife photography work, noting its potential as a bear denning site, though it had remained unoccupied in recent seasons. It offered natural insulation, protection from the elements, and most importantly, obscurity from human intervention. Through the window, Jack could see Dr. Foster engaged in animated discussion with the extraction team, pointing at equipment and demonstrating preparation techniques with deliberate thoroughness. She was buying time, creating the window of opportunity they needed. When she briefly glanced toward the cabin, her expression was carefully neutral, but her slight nod confirmed the plan was proceeding. The moment of truth arrived as Jack knelt beside Ranger, his heart pounding with the magnitude of what he was proposing. "We need to move to somewhere safer," he said, using the calm, steady voice that had become their mode of communication. "Somewhere they won't find you and try to take you away, but you'll have to trust me completely and follow without hesitation." He held out his hand toward her, palm up, a gesture of invitation rather than command. In this moment, he acknowledged fully what had been building throughout their extraordinary interaction: recognition of Ranger's agency, her capacity to choose or reject his proposal. If she remained in the cabin, he would have to abandon the plan and hope the transport could be conducted safely. If she followed, they would be crossing a boundary in human-wildlife interaction that had profound implications for both species. For a long moment, Ranger remained motionless, her dark eyes studying Jack's face with unmistakable assessment. Then, with deliberate movement that took his breath away, she gathered Scout gently in her mouth, the natural carrying method for bear mothers, and rose to her feet. She looked at Jack, then at the door, then back at him, the message as clear as if she had spoken: "Lead, and I will follow." With heart pounding, Jack eased open the cabin's rear door that faced away from where Dr. Foster was keeping the extraction team occupied. The approaching storm had brought premature darkness, providing natural cover for their escape. He stepped outside, turning to ensure Ranger was following. The bear moved with deliberate care. Scout held gently in her mouth, while Nova remained secured against her body by one powerful foreleg. The sight struck Jack with its profound abnormality. A wild black bear willingly following a human, carrying her cubs in a coordinated escape from other humans. Nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for this moment of cross-species cooperation. Scientifically, ethically, professionally, this action defied categorization. Jack led the way, moving slowly enough for Ranger to follow comfortably, while maintaining enough pace to put distance between them and the cabin before their absence was discovered. The forest floor was treacherous, with partially melted snow refreezing into slick patches, requiring careful navigation. He carried the essential supplies in his backpack, the weight a constant reminder of the responsibility he had assumed for this small family's survival. Their progress was slow but steady, following a route Jack had mentally mapped to avoid the trails that might be checked once their absence was discovered. The darkness worked in their favor, concealing their movements, while Jack's intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed him to navigate by landmarks barely visible in the gloom. A distinctive rock formation here, the silhouette of a lightning-struck pine there. Ranger followed with remarkable focus, occasionally pausing to adjust her grip on Scout or to ensure Nova remained secure against her body. The trust she displayed continued to astonish Jack. A mother bear with newborn cubs, traditionally the most dangerous wildlife encounter possible, placing her family's safety in human hands. The weight of that trust pressed on him with each careful step through the darkened forest. The distant sound of voices reached them as they crested a small ridge. The extraction team had discovered their absence. Jack increased their pace slightly, guiding them toward a small stream that would help mask their trail. The water was painfully cold as they crossed, numbing Jack's feet despite his insulated boots. He turned to help Ranger navigate the slippery, rocks, but found she was managing with impressive dexterity, keeping her cubs above the water level with careful movements. The cave formation lay in a secluded hollow beneath a natural stone outcropping, its entrance partially concealed by fallen logs and dense underbrush. Jack had discovered it years earlier while tracking a fox family for photographs, noting its potential as a natural shelter. Now it represented their best hope for a secure haven away from human intervention. Jack paused at the entrance, using his flashlight to check for current occupants or hazards. The beam revealed a space larger than it appeared from outside. A main chamber roughly 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with a smaller alcove to one side. The floor was relatively dry, covered with natural debris that could be arranged into suitable bedding. Most importantly, it offered protection from both the elements and discovery. He turned to Ranger, who stood watching with Scout still held carefully in her mouth. "This is it," he said softly, "our new shelter until it's safe." As if understanding his words, Ranger moved forward, entering the cave with cautious steps. She circled the main chamber once, inspecting the space, then carefully placed Scout in the drier alcove area. She returned to the entrance, looking expectantly at Jack, as if waiting for him to bring the supplies she now associated with her cub's care. The next hour passed in focused activity as Jack transformed the natural cave into a functional shelter. He arranged the emergency blankets to create insulation against the cold stone, established a small, ventilated heating system using the camping equipment from his pack, and organized the medical supplies for easy access. Throughout his preparations, Ranger watched attentively, occasionally adjusting her cub's position or attending to their needs, but always maintaining awareness of Jack's movements. When the basic setup was complete, Jack administered Ranger's evening medications, hiding them in high-value food as Dr. Foster had taught him. The bear accepted this routine with now familiar cooperation, consuming the medicated food while maintaining eye contact with Jack. The cubs were active and nursing well, positive signs that the stress of the journey hadn't compromised their fragile health. As the full darkness of night settled around their hidden sanctuary, Jack allowed himself to acknowledge the magnitude of what he had done. He had directly contravened professional protocols, administrative directives, and possibly even wildlife regulations. His career as a ranger might be over when this situation resolved. Yet watching Ranger tend to her cubs in their new shelter, he couldn't summon regret for his decision. Something more fundamental than professional ethics had guided his choice. A recognition of individual need and a respect for the remarkable trust this wild animal had placed in him. The night passed in cycles of vigilance and brief rest. Jack maintained the small heating system, monitored the cub's condition, and kept watch at the cave entrance for any signs of pursuit. Ranger seemed to understand the need for concealment, maintaining unusual quiet and restraining her cubs from making the squeaking sounds that had become more frequent as they grew stronger. By dawn, the approaching storm had arrived in full force, bringing driving sleet that quickly coated the forest in a fresh layer of ice. The weather created a natural barrier against search efforts, though Jack maintained careful watch nonetheless. The cave's orientation protected them from the direct assault of the elements, while the heating system maintained a survivable temperature within their shelter. Jack used the satellite communicator he had brought to send a brief, encrypted message to Dr. Foster's personal device, a prearranged signal confirming they had reached safety. He couldn't risk more detailed communication that might be traced, but he knew the veterinarian would be concerned about both their whereabouts and the medical condition of her patients. The response came hours later, a single word that spoke. Volumes. Understood. Dr. Foster had received his confirmation and would maintain the fiction that she had no knowledge of their location. Jack knew she was placing her own professional standing at risk by not immediately reporting his actions, adding another layer of responsibility to his decision. The day passed in the strange intimacy of their shared confinement. Jack maintained detailed notes and photographs, documenting the cub's development and Ranger's improving condition. The infection that had threatened her health was responding well to the antibiotics, while proper nutrition had visibly increased her milk production. The cubs were growing noticeably, their small bodies filling out and their movements becoming more coordinated. What continued to fascinate Jack most was Ranger's behavior toward him. Rather than merely tolerating his presence, as might be expected of a wild animal accepting necessary assistance, she displayed what could only be described as active cooperation. She would position her cubs for his inspection during their health checks, accept medications without resistance, and even seem to communicate basic needs through body language and eye contact. On the second morning in their hideaway, Jack witnessed something that challenged even his expanding understanding of bear intelligence. Scout, the more adventurous cub, had squirmed away from his mother's side and was attempting to explore the cave's perimeter. He approached dangerously, close to the small heating unit Jack had established. Before Jack could intervene, Ranger made a distinctive huffing sound, a vocalization he had never heard from her before. Scout immediately froze, then crawled back toward his mother's side. It was a clear display of communication, a mother warning her cub of danger and the cub responding appropriately. What made it remarkable was not the communication itself, which was natural behavior for bears, but the context. Ranger had identified a human-created object as a potential threat to her cub and communicated that assessment effectively. It suggested a level of situational awareness and adaptive intelligence that went beyond instinctive behavior. Jack documented this observation carefully, adding it to the growing body of evidence that Ranger's cognitive abilities exceeded conventional understanding of bear intelligence. Dr. Foster would find these records invaluable for the scientific and papers that would inevitably follow this unprecedented situation, assuming they all survived to tell the tale. On the third day, as the storm began to moderate, Jack's satellite communicator pinged with an incoming message. Dr. Foster had risked more detailed communication, encrypting it through multiple anonymous relays to protect their location. Extraction. Team departed yesterday. Management believes mother abandoned cubs, transported to wildlife center. I've maintained plausible deniability regarding your involvement. Storm expected to clear tomorrow. Contact when safe for medical assessment. Urgent, confirm cubs still viable. The message brought both relief and renewed concern. The immediate threat of forced extraction had passed, but the administrative narrative that Ranger had abandoned her cubs, who were then rescued, created new complications for their eventual return to legitimate care. Jack would need to find a way to reintegrate them into official channels without triggering punitive responses or endangering the cubs' welfare. He composed a careful reply, focusing on the medical information Dr. Foster needed most. Both cubs healthy, nursing well. Mother's infection responding to treatment. Will contact when storm clears for consultation on next steps. As he sent the message, Jack became aware of Ranger watching him intently, her dark eyes fixed on the communicator in his hands. Her focus on the device was so deliberate, it almost seemed she understood its significance, that it represented connection to the outside world and potential assistance or threat. Jack found himself explaining to her, continuing the one-sided conversations that had become natural despite their apparent absurdity. "That's Dr. Foster checking on you and the cubs," he said, showing her the device before stowing it in his pack. "She helped us get away from the people who wanted to take you somewhere you didn't want to go. We'll need to figure out what happens next once the storm passes." Ranger maintained that unnerving eye contact for several moments before turning her attention back to her cubs. Scout had become increasingly mobile, making determined efforts to explore their confined space whenever his mother's vigilance momentarily lapsed. Nova remained more reserved, but was showing improved strength and responsiveness, both positive signs for cubs their age. The storm cleared overnight, leaving a transformed landscape of crystalline beauty and treacherous footing outside. Their shelter. Jack ventured out at dawn to assess conditions and check for any signs that their hideaway had been discovered. The forest was silent except for the occasional crack of overburdened branches shedding their load of ice, and the distant calls of ravens taking advantage of the clearing weather to search for food. Upon returning to the cave, Jack found Ranger in apparent distress, making soft whimpering sounds as she attempted to adjust her position. Concerned, he approached carefully, speaking in the calm tones that had become their method of communication. A closer examination revealed the source of her discomfort. One of her milk-producing glands was swollen and hot to the touch, showing the classic signs of mastitis, a bacterial infection common in nursing mammals but potentially dangerous if untreated. This development required medical intervention beyond the supplies Jack had brought. He needed to consult with Dr. Foster immediately and potentially arrange for additional medications. Using the satellite communicator, he sent an urgent message, describing the symptoms and requesting guidance. Dr. Foster's response was prompt and concerned. Classic mastitis symptoms. Need antibiotics specifically for lactation infection. Can rendezvous at North Fire Road Junction, 2 miles from your last known position. Will come alone with medical supplies at sunset. Confirm if possible. The proposed meeting point was reasonably close to their hideaway, but would require leaving Ranger and the cubs alone for at least an hour, something Jack had avoided since their escape from the cabin. Yet without the proper medications, Ranger's condition would deteriorate rapidly, compromising both her health and her ability to nurse her cubs. Jack explained the situation to Ranger as he prepared for the journey, continuing the practice of verbal communication that seemed to reassure her even if she couldn't understand his specific words. "I need to get medicine for you," he said, gesturing to the painful swelling she was obviously experiencing. "I'll have to leave for a short time, but I'll come back. You and the cubs will be safer staying hidden here." Whether by coincidence or genuine understanding, Ranger shifted position to more effectively shield her cubs from the cave entrance, settling into what appeared to be a restful posture despite her obvious discomfort. The behavior almost seemed like acknowledgement of his plan, an accommodation to the temporary separation necessary for obtaining help. Jack departed with mixed emotions, constantly looking back toward the hidden cave entrance until it disappeared from view behind the forest's ice-laden vegetation. The rendezvous point Dr. Foster had suggested was a seldom-used service road junction that provided access for fire management, but saw little regular traffic, especially during winter conditions. The journey took longer than anticipated, the ice-covered terrain requiring careful navigation to prevent injury. Jack maintained heightened awareness throughout, concerned about potential monitoring of the area by Forestry Service personnel, searching for the missing bears. The administrative belief that Ranger had abandoned her cubs would reduce the urgency of any search, but standard protocols would still require documentation of wildlife movements after such an unusual incident. He reached the rendezvous point as the winter sun was setting, casting long shadows across the glistening landscape. The Fire Road Junction was deserted, no sign yet of Dr. Foster's approach. Jack positioned himself with good visibility in both directions while maintaining cover that would allow quick concealment if unauthorized vehicles appeared. 20 minutes later, a single set of headlights appeared through the trees, moving slowly along the barely passable road. Jack remained hidden until he could confirm it was Dr. Foster's personal vehicle rather than a Forestry Service truck. When the familiar blue SUV came into view, he stepped out cautiously, still scanning for any signs of surveillance or accompaniment. Dr. Foster emerged alone, carrying a medical pack and moving quickly to meet him. Her expression showed equal parts relief and professional concern. "You're taking an enormous risk coming here," she said without preamble. "Management has questions about your sudden illness and disappearance coinciding with the bear incident." "How much trouble am I in?" Jack asked, accepting the medical supplies she handed him. "Professionally, significant. They suspect you intervened but can't prove anything without finding you and the bears." She hesitated, then added, "Personally, I think you made the right call. The extraction team was operating on protocol rather than medical assessment. Transport would have been high risk for cubs that young." They moved to the shelter of her vehicle to review Ranger's symptoms and the appropriate treatment. Dr. Foster provided detailed instructions on administering the medications and managing the mastitis, her clinical expertise temporarily overriding any concerns about the unorthodox situation. "The antibiotics need to be injected for fastest effect," she explained, demonstrating the technique on an orange she had brought for the purpose. "Normally this would require sedation or substantial restraint, but given the unusual trust relationship you've described, she'll allow it," Jack said with quiet confidence. "She's accepted every other treatment without resistance. She seems to understand we're helping." Dr. Foster's scientific skepticism warred visibly with her growing acceptance of this extraordinary case. "The behavioral implications are significant. When this is resolved, the documentation you're gathering could revolutionize our understanding of bear cognition and adaptive intelligence." Their consultation complete, Dr. Foster provided additional supplies, more medications, specialized formula as backup if Ranger's milk production became compromised, and high-calorie food concentrates for both the mother bear and Jack himself. As they prepared to part ways, she hesitated, then spoke in a more personal tone. "This isn't just professional interest for you anymore, is it? You've crossed a boundary into personal investment in their survival." Jack couldn't deny it. The days spent in close proximity with Ranger and her cubs, witnessing their vulnerability and remarkable adaptability, had created a connection that transcended scientific observation or conservation ethics. "Yes," he admitted, "but that doesn't make the scientific documentation any less valid. It just adds a dimension." "Be careful with that dimension," Dr. Foster warned gently. "Wild animals remain wild, no matter how much trust they display in unusual circumstances, and management will be looking for any evidence of improper habituation if and when you bring them back into official channels." With a final exchange of information, including a secure communication protocol that would better protect their locations, they parted ways, Dr. Foster returning to her official duties while maintaining plausible deniability about Jack's whereabouts, and Jack beginning the careful journey back to the cave hideaway. The forest was transformed in darkness, the ice-covered landscape reflecting moonlight in disorienting patterns that made navigation challenging. Jack moved with careful precision, aware that injury in these conditions could prove fatal not just for him, but for the bear family dependent on his care. The weight of the medical supplies in his pack was a tangible reminder of the responsibility he had assumed, far beyond professional duty into something more profound and personal. When he finally approached the cave entrance, he called out softly to announce his presence, not wanting to startle Ranger after his absence. The interior was darker than when he had left, the heating system having dimmed to conservation mode in his absence. As his eyes adjusted, he made out Ranger's form in her customary position, cubs nestled against her, but her posture alert, oriented toward the entrance as if she had been awaiting his return. "I brought medicine that will help you feel better," Jack explained, resuming the verbal communication that had become their routine. He approached slowly, showing her the medical kit, before beginning preparations for the injection Dr. Foster had prescribed. What followed tested the extraordinary. Trust they had established more profoundly than any previous interaction. Administering an injection to a wild bear, particularly a mother with cubs, without sedation or restraint, violated every safety protocol in wildlife management. Yet, as Jack prepared the syringe and explained what he needed to do, Ranger watched. With that unsettling intelligence, her eyes tracking his movements with apparent understanding. When he approached with the prepared injection, Ranger shifted position slightly, exposing the area where the mastitis infection was most pronounced. The movement was so deliberate, so perfectly aligned with what was medically necessary, that Jack momentarily froze in astonishment. It was as if she had understood not just that he was helping, but specifically how he needed to help. "This will hurt briefly," he warned softly, positioning the syringe. "But it will make you feel better soon." With careful precision, Jack administered the injection, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Ranger flinched slightly at the needle's penetration, but maintained her position, allowing him to complete the procedure without resistance. Only when he had withdrawn the needle and moved back did she shift to check on her cubs, who had remained quiet throughout the process. The level of cooperation Ranger had displayed went beyond anything Jack could explain through conventional understanding of wild animal behavior. This wasn't merely tolerance of human presence or acceptance of care. This was active participation in medical treatment, suggesting a cognitive understanding that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between human and animal intelligence. As he recorded the treatment in his notes, documenting both the medical procedure and Ranger's extraordinary behavior, Jack found himself confronting questions that went beyond wildlife management into the realm of animal cognition and ethics. If bears, traditionally viewed as instinct-driven wild animals, were capable of this level of understanding and cooperation, what did that imply about their consciousness, their capacity for choice, their right to agency in human interactions? The philosophical implications were profound, potentially reshaping the ethical framework for wildlife conservation and management. Yet at this moment, those larger questions remained abstract compared to the immediate reality of caring for this remarkable bear family until they could safely return to legitimate channels of oversight and protection. Over the next days, Ranger's condition improved rapidly under the specialized treatment. The mastitis infection responded well to the antibiotics, the swelling and discomfort visibly diminishing. Her milk production stabilized, ensuring proper nutrition for the growing cubs, who were becoming increasingly active and aware of their surroundings. Jack maintained detailed documentation throughout, creating a comprehensive record of medical treatments, behavioral observations, and developmental milestones. The cubs' eyes had opened fully now, their coordination improving daily as they attempted increasingly ambitious explorations of their confined space. Scout remained the more adventurous, often requiring gentle retrieval when his curiosity carried him too near the cave entrance or the heating equipment. Nova showed more physical caution but greater observational awareness, often watching Jack's activities with focused attention that echoed her mother's intelligence. Regular communication with Dr. Foster provided professional oversight and planning for their eventual reintegration into official care. The administrative narrative that Ranger had abandoned her cubs, who were then rescued, had solidified in the Forestry Service's documentation, creating both challenges and opportunities for their return. The challenge was explaining Ranger's presence with cubs she had supposedly abandoned. The opportunity was that search efforts had diminished based on the assumption that she had returned to the wilderness alone. The Wildlife Center is preparing for the cubs' arrival without the mother, Dr. Foster reported during one encrypted communication. We'll need to consider how to reintroduce Ranger to the official narrative without triggering punitive responses or separation from the cubs. This planning took on greater urgency as the cubs continued to develop. While still dependent on their mother's milk, they were reaching a stage where more space and environmental stimulation would become increasingly important for proper development. The natural cave, while adequate as an emergency shelter, lacked the facilities for longer-term rehabilitation care. On their 10th day in hiding, a development forced Jack's hand. Scout, ever the explorer, had managed to slip past Jack's vigilance and venture outside the cave entrance during a brief period when both Jack and Ranger were focused on Nova's feeding. The cub's absence was discovered quickly, but in the crucial minutes it took to locate him just outside the entrance, Scout had encountered something potentially dangerous, a patch of antifreeze that had leaked from Jack's heating equipment. The bright green liquid had apparently attracted the curious cub, who had ingested a small amount before being retrieved. Antifreeze contained ethylene glycol, highly toxic to mammals and requiring immediate medical intervention. Jack's limited supplies did not include the specific treatments needed for this poisoning, and Scout's condition deteriorated rapidly, his small body convulsing as the toxin took effect. The situation presented a terrible choice: maintain their hiding place and almost certainly lose Scout to the poisoning, or risk exposure by seeking professional medical help that could save the cub but potentially separate the family permanently. For Jack, it was no choice at all. Scout's life took precedence over all other considerations. Using the secure channel, he sent an emergency message to Dr. Foster. Cub ingested antifreeze. Critical condition. Need immediate medical intervention. Will proceed to emergency rendezvous point with both cubs and mother. The emergency rendezvous point was a prearranged location they had established for exactly this kind of situation. A small clearing accessible by service road where Dr. Foster could bring medical equipment without attracting undue attention. Reaching it would require traversing nearly 2 miles of difficult terrain, with a sick cub and a wild bear in tow, a journey that defied conventional wildlife management practices on every level. Jack gathered the essential supplies and medical records, securing everything in his pack while explaining the situation to Ranger in the calm tones that had become their method of communication. "Scout is very sick," he said, gesturing to the now lethargic cub. "We need to get him to Dr. Foster for medicine I don't have. It means leaving our safe place and risking being seen by others." Whether through actual understanding or coincidental timing, Ranger's response was immediate and decisive. She gathered Nova gently in her mouth, the traditional carrying method for bear mothers, and moved toward the cave entrance, looking back at Jack expectantly. He carefully lifted Scout, wrapping the sick cub in an insulated blanket to maintain his body temperature during the journey. Morning light filtered through the forest canopy, casting dappled patterns across the clearing where Jack had positioned himself for one final observation session. A full year had passed since the remarkable journey with Ranger and her cubs had begun. A year that had transformed his understanding of wildlife behavior and challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between wild and human domains. From his carefully concealed position, Jack watched as the bear family emerged from the tree line into the sun-drenched meadow. The difference from their first encounters was striking. The cubs, now healthy yearlings, moved with growing confidence and independence, their bodies substantial and strong after a full seasonal cycle of development under their extraordinary mother's guidance. Scout maintained his adventurous nature, leading explorations of the meadow perimeter while demonstrating the climbing skills Ranger had methodically taught him throughout their remarkable journey. Nova remained more methodical, her movements displaying the thoughtful assessment and problem-solving approach that had characterized her development from the beginning. Ranger herself embodied the perfect balance their rehabilitation had achieved. A fully wild bear, functioning naturally in her forest habitat, utilizing all her natural instincts and abilities while incorporating the unique experiences of their shared journey into her remarkable teaching repertoire. Her body had regained the powerful symmetry of a healthy adult black bear in her prime, with glossy fur and fluid movements that showed no trace of the desperate condition that had first driven her to seek human shelter during that extraordinary winter storm. The scientific publication documenting their case study had been released the previous month, creating significant discussion throughout the wildlife management community. Cognitive flexibility and adaptive rehabilitation in American black bears, case study in cooperative conservation, had presented their observations with rigorous scientific methodology while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the intervention that had made them possible. The paper challenged conventional rehabilitation protocols by demonstrating the potential for more adaptive approaches based on recognition of individual cognitive capacity and behavioral indicators. Initial response from the scientific community had been a fascinating mixture of professional interest and methodological questioning, exactly what they had anticipated for such an unorthodox case study. Some traditionalists questioned whether their observations could be replicated or represented an aberrant individual rather than broader species capacity, while more progressive researchers embraced the implications for evolution of rehabilitation. Approaches based on recognition of greater cognitive complexity in wild animals. Dr. Foster had presented their findings at the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Conference, where her careful balance of scientific rigor and acknowledgement of the extraordinary circumstances had earned respectful attention, even from initially skeptical colleagues. The video documentation showing Ranger's voluntary participation in medical treatment of her cubs had particularly challenged conventional assumptions about maternal bear behavior and cognitive capacity. Marcus had incorporated elements of their adaptive approach into regional rehabilitation protocols, creating carefully defined exceptions for circumstances where animals demonstrated similar behavioral indicators of cognitive flexibility and cooperative potential. These protocol adjustments maintained appropriate boundaries for standard wildlife management, while allowing recognition of exceptional cases where more adaptive approaches might better serve both conservation goals and individual animal welfare. Dr. Chen had supported broader dissemination of their findings through scientific channels, while carefully managing administrative aspects to protect the professional standing of those who had made the unorthodox intervention decisions. Her background in research methodology had helped frame their observations within larger scientific contexts of animal cognition studies, strengthening the case for their significance beyond the specific circumstances of this remarkable bear family. Jack's own perspective had evolved throughout this extraordinary year of documentation and analysis. His initial focus on wildlife observation and photography had expanded to include deeper questions about animal cognition, interspecies communication, and the ethical frameworks guiding human-wildlife interaction. While maintaining scientific rigor in their formal case study, he had also developed a more philosophical exploration of what their experience suggested about potential for understanding across traditional species boundaries. Today marked the conclusion of their formal documentation project and transition to standard wildlife monitoring practices. The intensive observation phase had gathered comprehensive data on the bear family's remarkable journey from emergency intervention to successful rewilding. Now they would step back completely, allowing Ranger and her cubs the fully wild existence they had earned through their extraordinary adaptation and resilience. Through his binoculars, Jack watched as Ranger demonstrated optimal foraging techniques in a patch of ripe blackberries, showing the cubs how to identify the most nutritious fruits while avoiding thorns and unstable footing. Her teaching remained remarkably specific and intentional, providing step-by-step guidance tailored to each cub's developing abilities and learning style. This sophisticated instruction, documented throughout their extraordinary journey, represented one of the most significant scientific findings of their case study, challenging conventional understanding of bear cognition and maternal behavior. The family's movement through the meadow followed natural patterns, optimized for efficient resource utilization. They maintained appropriate distance from the research facility visible on the distant hillside, not avoiding human structures with stress-inducing fear, not approaching with dangerous habituation, but incorporating awareness of human elements into a balanced territorial understanding that represented ideal coexistence in shared landscapes. As Jack observed this healthy wild family functioning in their natural environment, he reflected on the deeper significance of what their extraordinary journey represented. Beyond the scientific data and conservation protocols, the experience had demonstrated capacity for mutual recognition across species boundaries, not anthropomorphizing wild animals into human frameworks, not reducing them to instinctive automatons, but acknowledging individual intelligence and agency that allowed for moments of genuine interspecies understanding. Ranger had never become dependent or habituated in the problematic sense that wildlife managers feared. Throughout their remarkable interaction, she had maintained her essential wild nature while demonstrating cognitive flexibility and cooperative potential that transcended conventional categorization. Her extraordinary journey represented not a contradiction of wild animal essence, but an expansion of understanding about what that wildness encompassed, including capacity for discernment, assessment, and adaptive intelligence previously unrecognized in wildlife management frameworks. The yearlings continued their exploration of the meadow under their mother's watchful guidance, their bodies growing stronger and their behaviors more sophisticated with each passing day. In another year, they would likely separate from Ranger, as natural bear development dictated, establishing their own territories and incorporating the exceptional education she had provided into their independent lives. Whatever challenges they faced in their wild futures, they carried the benefits of their extraordinary beginning. Not just physical survival against significant odds, but a remarkable learning experience that had equipped them with exceptional skills and adaptability. Movement at the meadow edge drew Jack's attention as Ranger raised her head in alert assessment. A large male black bear had appeared at the forest boundary, his substantial body and confident movements identifying him as the resident male whose territory overlapped this region. In previous encounters documented through their monitoring, System Ranger had demonstrated sophisticated avoidance strategies to protect her cubs from potential threats. Today, with the yearlings growing and the male showing no immediate aggressive intent, she maintained watchful distance while continuing her teaching, a perfect display of appropriate wild behavior, balancing multiple factors in complex natural interactions. This natural scene, with its multiple bear individuals demonstrating species-typical behaviors within their forest ecosystem, represented the ultimate success of their unprecedented intervention. What had begun as an emergency rescue during extraordinary circumstances had evolved into successful reintegration of a thriving bear family into their natural habitat and roles. The scientific documentation of this journey would contribute to wildlife management understanding for years to come, potentially influencing rehabilitation approaches for similar exceptional circumstances while respecting appropriate boundaries. For standard situations, as morning advanced and the sun rose higher above the mountain landscape, the bear family completed their meadow foraging and prepared to move deeper into the forest. Ranger gathered her cubs with gentle guidance, leading them toward a stand of mature oaks that would provide both food resources and climbing opportunities for continued skill development. Their movement carried the natural grace of wild bears, perfectly adapted to their forest environment, their bodies and behaviors showing no trace of the extraordinary intervention that had enabled their survival against significant odds. Before disappearing into the forest depths, Ranger paused at the edge of the clearing. Her head turned toward Jack's observation position with that remarkable intentionality he had witnessed throughout their extraordinary journey. A moment of apparent awareness that transcended conventional understanding of wild animal perception, whether through exceptional sensory capacity or some deeper recognition. She seemed to acknowledge the human presence that had become an element in her complex understanding of this territory. For a brief moment, their eyes connected across the clearing, wild bear and human observer linked in mutual awareness that respected appropriate boundaries while acknowledging the remarkable journey they had shared. Then, with deliberate movements that maintained her essential wild dignity, Ranger led her cubs into the forest depths, disappearing into the wilderness that was their rightful home. Jack remained motionless, watching the empty space where the bear family had vanished among the trees. The scientific documentation was complete, the case study published, the rehabilitation successful by every measurable standard. Yet beyond these professional accomplishments, he carried something less easily categorized from this extraordinary experience: a deeper understanding of the potential for connection across traditional boundaries, a recognition of intelligence and awareness in wild beings that transcended conventional categorization. As he packed his observation equipment for the final time, Jack knew that Ranger and her cubs would continue their wild lives largely beyond human awareness. Exactly as it should be for healthy wild bears in their natural habitat. The monitoring cameras would occasionally document their movements through the territory, confirming their continued well-being without intrusive human presence. This appropriate distance represented the ultimate success of their rehabilitation. Approach, a return to natural patterns while maintaining the scientific documentation of this remarkable journey. The legacy of their extraordinary interaction would continue through multiple dimensions: the scientific case study influencing rehabilitation protocols, the cubs carrying their unique learning experiences into independent wild lives, and the humans involved carrying deeper understanding of what was possible in the space between wild and human domains, when approached with respect, observation, and recognition of individual capacity. Jack made his way down the forest trail toward the research facility one last time, his pack containing the final observation notes that would complete their comprehensive documentation. The morning sunlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating a landscape transformed by seasonal abundance, the same forest that had witnessed the desperate winter beginning of their extraordinary journey now flourishing in summer vitality. As he walked, a raven called from the branches above, its intelligent eyes following his movement along the trail. Jack smiled at this wild observer, acknowledging the complex awareness that existed throughout the natural world when humans took time to recognize and respect it. The extraordinary journey with Ranger and her cubs had reinforced what the best naturalists had always understood: that wildness encompassed not just instinct and biological programming, but intelligence, awareness, and capacity for connection that transcended conventional human categories. The scientific papers would document the measurable outcomes and methodological approaches, contributing valuable data to wildlife rehabilitation practices. But the deeper understanding that had emerged from this remarkable experience would continue influencing his perspective on human-wildlife relationships in ways that extended beyond scientific categorization, recognition that the boundaries, between species were more permeable to understanding than traditional frameworks acknowledged, and that mutual respect could create moments of genuine connection without compromising the essential wildness that defined these remarkable creatures. The research facility appeared through the trees ahead, its simple structure representing the human element in this complex ecosystem. Jack's time there was concluding, his extraordinary documentation project complete. He would return to his regular ranger duties with transformed understanding of the wildlife under his stewardship, not just as population units to be managed, but as individuals with varying capacities for adaptation, learning, and even in exceptional circumstances, cooperation across traditional boundaries. Ranger and her cubs would continue their wild lives in the forest that was their proper home, carrying the benefits of their extraordinary journey while fully reintegrating into natural patterns. Their remarkable story would continue influencing wildlife management approaches through the documented case study, potentially creating more nuanced rehabilitation protocols for similar exceptional circumstances, while maintaining appropriate boundaries for standard wildlife management. As Jack reached the facility clearing and looked back toward the forest, depths where the bear family had disappeared, he carried with him the privilege of having witnessed something remarkable. A wild bear's extraordinary journey from desperate survival to successful rewilding, demonstrating intelligence and adaptability that challenged conventional understanding while never relinquishing her essential wild nature. Whatever scientific categories ultimately framed their documented observations, the deeper recognition of potential for understanding across species boundaries would remain a transformative element of this extraordinary shared journey. The mountain landscape stretched before him, its wilderness encompassing countless stories of survival, adaptation, and connection that mostly unfolded beyond human awareness. Ranger's extraordinary journey had briefly illuminated one such story through exceptional circumstances, providing glimpses of intelligence and awareness in wild beings that might inform more respectful, nuanced approaches to the increasingly shared landscapes where human and wildlife domains intersected. With that awareness, Jack turned toward the research facility to complete his documentation, carrying both scientific data and deeper understanding from an extraordinary year that had transformed perspectives on what was possible in the space between wild and human worlds when approached with observation, respect, and recognition of remarkable capacity for mutual understanding. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.